Understanding the difference between right and wrong is one of humanity's oldest and most important questions. For thousands of years, philosophers, religious leaders and thinkers have grappled with this fundamental challenge that shapes every aspect of human life. Today, modern science gives us remarkable insights into how morality actually works in our brains, our societies, and across different cultures around the world. This exploration will take you through what we now know about right and wrong based on solid research and evidence rather than mere opinion or tradition. We will discover that morality is not arbitrary or purely cultural, but has deep roots in human nature and universal patterns that appear across all societies. By the end of this journey, you will have a clearer understanding of why certain actions feel right or wrong and how you can make better moral decisions in your own life. Part 1. The Universal Foundation. The most groundbreaking discovery in modern moral research happened when anthropologists at the University of Oxford conducted the largest and most comprehensive study of human morality ever undertaken. They analysed ethnographic accounts of ethics from 60 different societies, examining over 600,000 words from more than 600 sources. What they found challenges the common belief that morality is completely relative and differs from culture to culture. Instead, they discovered 7 universal moral rules that appear in every single human society they studied. These 7 behaviours are always considered morally good without exception. First is helping your family, which includes caring for relatives, honouring parents, and protecting children. Second is helping your group, which means cooperating with community members, showing loyalty to your society, and contributing to collective welfare. Third is returning favours, which involves reciprocity, gratitude, and keeping promises. Fourth is being brave, which includes defending others, standing up for what is right and facing danger when necessary. Fifth is deferring to superiors, which means respecting legitimate authority, following social hierarchies and honouring those with wisdom or experience. Sixth is dividing resources fairly, which involves sharing, avoiding greed, and ensuring everyone gets their due portion. Seventh is respecting the property of others, which means not stealing, not destroying what belongs to others, and honouring ownership rights. What makes this discovery so profound is not just that these behaviours appear everywhere, but that there were absolutely no counterexamples found anywhere in the world. No society was discovered where any of these 7 behaviours were considered morally bad or wrong. This finding demolishes the argument that morality is completely arbitrary or purely a matter of cultural preference. While cultures may express these values differently, emphasize some more than others, or apply them in various ways, the underlying foundation remains remarkably consistent across all human societies. Think about what this means for our understanding of human nature. Despite vast differences in language, religion, technology, and social organization, humans everywhere have independently arrived at the same basic moral framework. A society in ancient Mesopotamia, a tribal community in the Amazon rainforest, a modern industrial nation, and a nomadic group in Central Asia all recognize these same 7 principles as morally important. This suggests that these moral rules are not random cultural inventions, but rather reflect something deep and fundamental about what it means to be human. The reason these universal moral rules exist becomes clear when we consider the challenges that every human society must solve to survive and thrive. Humans are social creatures who depend on cooperation for survival, but cooperation is fragile and easily disrupted by selfishness, conflict, and misunderstanding. The 7 universal rules directly address the main threats to social cooperation. Family loyalty ensures that the basic units of society remain stable and that children are cared for. Group loyalty prevents societies from fragmenting into competing factions. Reciprocity builds trust and ensures that cooperative relationships continue over time. Bravery protects the community from external threats and internal wrongdoing. Respect for authority maintains social order and prevents chaos. Fair resource distribution prevents destructive conflicts over material goods. Respect for property provides security and incentives for productive work. These moral rules are not perfect solutions to social problems, and different societies balance them in different ways. Sometimes they can even conflict with each other, creating moral dilemmas where we must choose between competing values. For example, loyalty to family might conflict with fairness to others, or respect for authority might conflict with the need for bravery in challenging wrongdoing. But the fact that all societies wrestle with these same basic tensions shows that we are all working with the same fundamental moral framework. This universal foundation also explains why moral arguments across cultures often make sense to us, even when we disagree with specific conclusions. When someone from a different culture argues that a particular action is wrong because it harms family relationships, or violates reciprocity, or shows disrespect for legitimate authority, we can understand their reasoning even if we might weigh these factors differently. The underlying moral vocabulary is shared even when the specific applications vary. This shared foundation provides hope for moral dialogue and understanding across cultural boundaries, because we are not starting from completely different moral universes. Part 2. How evolution shaped our moral sense. The story of human morality begins millions of years ago, long before humans walked the earth. Scientists have discovered that the building blocks of moral behavior can be found throughout the animal kingdom, particularly among social species that must cooperate to survive. Chimpanzees, our closest living relatives, show remarkable behaviors that look surprisingly similar to human moral responses. They remember who has helped them and who has harmed them. They share food with friends. They comfort others in distress. And they even punish group members who break social rules. But the evolutionary story of morality goes far beyond our primate cousins. Elephants have been observed helping injured family members and mourning their dead. Dolphins rescue drowning companions and share resources with those in need. Even rats will help free a trapped cage mate, even when there is no obvious benefit to themselves. These behaviors suggest that the capacity for what we might call premoral behavior, the building blocks of morality, evolved independently in many different species because it provided survival advantages. Animals that could cooperate, share resources and help each other were more likely to survive and reproduce than purely selfish individuals. The human moral sense builds on these ancient foundations, but adds something uniquely powerful, our ability to reason about right and wrong in abstract terms. While a chimpanzee might share food with a friend, humans can develop principles about fairness that apply to strangers they have never met. While an elephant might help a family member in distress, humans can feel moral obligations to help people on the other side of the world whom they will never encounter. This expansion of moral concern beyond our immediate social circle represents one of the most remarkable developments in the history of life on Earth. Evolution shaped our moral emotions in ways that we can still feel today. The surge of anger you feel when you witness injustice, the guilt that gnaws at you when you have hurt someone, the warm satisfaction that comes from helping others, these are not arbitrary feelings, but evolved responses that helped our ancestors navigate complex social environments. Individuals who felt guilty about harming others were more likely to maintain valuable social relationships. Those who felt angry about unfairness were more motivated to defend themselves and their communities from exploitation. People who experienced joy from helping others were more likely to build the cooperative networks that provided security and resources in times of need. These emotional responses were so important for survival that they became deeply embedded in our psychology. However, understanding the evolutionary origins of morality does not mean that our current moral intuitions are always correct, or that we should simply follow our evolved impulses. Evolution designed our moral emotions for the small hunter-gatherer groups in which humans lived for most of our history, not for the complex modern world with its global communications, massive institutions, and technological power. Some of our evolved moral intuitions, like favouring our own group over others, can lead to harmful prejudice and conflict in modern diverse societies. Other moral challenges, like how to address climate change or regulate artificial intelligence, are completely new and cannot be solved by following ancient emotional responses. This is why human morality is not just about emotions, but also about reasoning. Evolution gave us not only moral feelings, but also the cognitive capacity to reflect on those feelings, to evaluate them, and to develop new moral principles that go beyond our initial intuitions. The abolition of slavery, the expansion of rights to women and minorities, the development of international human rights law, these moral advances happen not because our evolved instincts pointed the way, but because humans use their reasoning abilities to challenge existing practices and develop better moral frameworks. Evolution provided the foundation for morality, but human reason allows us to build upon that foundation in ways that our ancestors could never have imagined. Part 3. The Brain Science of Right and Wrong. Modern neuroscience has given us an unprecedented window into how moral judgment actually works in the human brain. When scientists use brain imaging technology to observe people making moral decisions, they discover that morality is not located in any single part of the brain, but involves a complex network of regions working together. Some of these brain areas process emotions, others handle logical reasoning, and still others integrate social information about the people involved in moral situations. This neurological complexity helps explain why moral decisions often feel both emotional and rational at the same time. One of the most important brain regions for moral judgment is the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, located just behind your forehead. This area integrates emotional and social information to help us understand the consequences of our actions for ourselves and others. When this region is damaged early in life, people often develop what scientists call acquired sociopathy, a condition where they understand moral rules intellectually but do not feel the emotional weight that normally motivates moral behavior. These individuals are more likely to lie, cheat, steal and harm others without experiencing the guilt and remorse that would normally restrain such behavior. This demonstrates that moral behavior requires not just understanding what is right and wrong, but also feeling that it matters. Morality is not just a matter of cold calculation, but involves our deepest emotions about human relationships and social bonds. Another crucial brain system for morality involves the mirror neurons, specialized cells that fire both when we perform an action and when we observe someone else performing the same action. These neurons help us understand what others are thinking and feeling, a capacity that psychologists call theory of mind. When you see someone in pain, your mirror neurons activate some of the same brain patterns that would fire if you were experiencing pain yourself. This neurological empathy provides the emotional foundation for moral concern about others. People with autism or certain other neurological conditions sometimes have difficulty with theory of mind, and they often struggle with social and moral reasoning as a result. This shows that the ability to understand others' minds is not just helpful for morality, but essential for it. Brain research has also revealed fascinating differences between how we process different types of moral situations. When people consider moral dilemmas that involve direct physical harm, like pushing someone off a bridge, their brains show strong activation in emotional processing areas that generate feelings of distress and prohibition. But when people consider moral dilemmas that involve indirect or statistical harm, like changing the route of a runaway trolley, their brains show more activation in reasoning areas that calculate costs and benefits. This helps explain why many people find it easier to support policies that will indirectly cause harm, like military interventions or economic policies with negative side effects, than to personally and directly harm another person. Our brains process up-close and personal moral situations differently than abstract and distant ones, even when the consequences might be identical. Understanding these neurological quirks can help us make more consistent and rational moral decisions. The speed of moral judgment is another remarkable finding from neuroscience research. Brain imaging shows that people often reach moral conclusions within milliseconds of encountering a moral situation, long before they have consciously reasoned through the implications. This suggests that much of our moral judgment operates below the level of conscious awareness, driven by rapid emotional and intuitive responses. However, these initial moral intuitions can be modified by slower, more deliberate reasoning processes if we take the time to reflect carefully on moral problems. This research supports the idea that good moral decision-making involves both trusting our moral emotions and subjecting them to rational scrutiny. Neither pure emotion nor pure reason alone is sufficient for navigating complex moral terrain. Part 4. How moral emotions work. Moral emotions are the driving force behind much of our ethical behavior, yet they operate in ways that most people never consciously notice. These emotions evolved to solve specific social problems, and they continue to shape our moral judgments in powerful and sometimes surprising ways. Understanding how moral emotions work can help us harness their wisdom while avoiding their potential pitfalls. The most fundamental moral emotions include guilt, shame, anger, disgust, empathy, and what psychologists call moral elevation, the warm feeling we get when witnessing acts of virtue or kindness. Guilt and shame are often confused, but they serve very different moral functions. Guilt focuses on specific actions and motivates us to make amends for wrongdoing. When you feel guilty about breaking a promise, lying to a friend, or failing to help someone in need, that emotion pushes you to apologize, tell the truth, or do better next time. Guilt is generally a healthy moral emotion because it focuses on changeable behavior rather than unchangeable identity. Shame, by contrast, involves negative feelings about the self as a whole rather than about specific actions. While shame can sometimes motivate moral behavior, it more often leads to withdrawal, defensiveness, and even aggressive retaliation against those who triggered the shameful feelings. People who experience chronic shame are actually more likely to engage in immoral behavior, perhaps because they feel they are already fundamentally bad and have nothing left to lose. Understanding this distinction can help us cultivate guilt when appropriate while avoiding the destructive spiral of shame. Moral anger serves as our internal justice system, motivating us to respond to unfairness and wrongdoing. When you see someone cutting in line, cheating on taxes, or bullying a vulnerable person, the anger you feel is not just an emotional reaction, but a moral signal that something important is being violated. This anger motivates us to intervene, to punish wrongdoers, and to defend moral norms that benefit everyone. However, moral anger can also be dangerous when it becomes self-righteous or disproportionate to the actual wrongdoing. History is filled with examples of moral anger leading to cruel punishments, violent conflicts, and the persecution of innocent people. The same emotion that motivates heroic efforts to stop injustice can also fuel mob violence and political extremism. Learning to feel moral anger without being controlled by it is one of the most important skills for ethical living. This requires pausing to consider whether our anger is proportionate, whether we have all the facts, and whether our proposed response will actually make the situation better rather than worse. Disgust is perhaps the most surprising moral emotion because it originally evolved to help us avoid contaminated food and disease, yet it now plays a major role in moral judgment. Many moral violations trigger the same feeling of revulsion that we experience when encountering rotten food or bodily waste. This connection between physical disgust and moral disgust appears across cultures and suggests that humans understand moral wrongdoing as a kind of contamination that must be avoided or cleansed. The language we use for morality reflects this connection as we talk about dirty deeds, clean consciences, and moral purity. However, the disgust response can also lead us astray morally, particularly when it targets people or behaviours that are different but not actually harmful. Many forms of prejudice and discrimination are driven more by disgust than by rational assessment of actual harm. Sexual minorities, people with disabilities, and members of different ethnic groups have often been targeted not because they cause genuine harm, but because they trigger disgust responses in others. Recognizing when our moral judgments are being driven by disgust rather than by careful consideration of actual harm can help us avoid these moral mistakes. Empathy is often considered the foundation of all moral emotion, but recent research has revealed that it is both more limited and more complex than many people assume. Empathy allows us to feel what others are feeling, which can motivate compassionate action and moral concern. However, empathy is naturally biased toward people who are similar to us, physically present and individually identifiable rather than part of a large group. We feel more empathy for one injured child whose story we know than for thousands of statistical victims of famine or disease. We feel more empathy for members of our own group than for outsiders, and more empathy for attractive people than for those who are less appealing. This means that empathy alone is not sufficient to guide moral judgment because it systematically favors some people over others in ways that have nothing to do with moral worth. Good moral reasoning requires expanding our concern beyond the narrow circle of people for whom we naturally feel empathy. This often means relying on moral principles and rational analysis rather than just emotional responses. Part 5. Cultural differences and universal patterns. While all human societies share the same basic moral foundation, they express and prioritize these values in strikingly different ways. Understanding these cultural differences is crucial for navigating our increasingly connected world, but it is equally important to recognize that cultural variation does not mean that all moral views are equally valid. The challenge is learning to respect legitimate cultural differences while maintaining our commitment to universal human values. This requires distinguishing between surface differences in moral expression and deeper differences in fundamental moral commitments. One of the most significant cultural differences in morality involves the balance between individual rights and collective responsibilities. Western cultures, particularly those influenced by European Enlightenment thinking, tend to emphasize individual autonomy, personal freedom, and individual rights as the foundation of moral thinking. People in these cultures often believe that individuals should be free to make their own choices about how to live, even when those choices conflict with traditional expectations or social norms. Eastern cultures, by contrast, often place greater emphasis on social harmony, collective welfare, and respect for authority and tradition. People in these cultures may believe that individual desires should be subordinated to family expectations, community needs, and social stability. Neither approach is entirely right or wrong, and both reflect different ways of balancing the universal human needs for both freedom and belonging. Another major cultural difference involves the role of purity and sanctity in moral judgment. Some cultures treat violations of religious or traditional purity codes as serious moral issues, while others view these same behaviors as matters of personal preference with no moral significance. For example, dietary restrictions, dress codes, sexual practices, and religious observances may be seen as fundamental moral requirements in some cultures and as optional lifestyle choices in others. These differences can create serious conflicts when people from different moral cultures interact, particularly around issues like religious freedom, gender roles, and sexual behavior. However, research suggests that even cultures that emphasize purity and sanctity still recognize the importance of harm prevention and fairness, even when they also care about additional moral concerns. This provides a foundation for moral dialogue even across seemingly incompatible cultural frameworks. The concept of honor represents another area where cultures differ significantly in their moral emphasis. Honor-based cultures place great importance on reputation, respect, and the willingness to defend oneself and one family from insult or attack. In such cultures, failing to respond to disrespect may be seen as a serious moral failing that brings shame not only on oneself, but on entire family and community networks. Dignity-based cultures, by contrast, emphasize the inherent worth of all individuals, regardless of their social status or reputation. People in dignity cultures may view honor-based responses to insult as primitive or counterproductive, while people in honor cultures may view dignity-based tolerance of disrespect as weak or immoral. These differences can lead to serious misunderstandings and conflicts, particularly in legal systems that must adjudicate disputes between people from different cultural backgrounds. Despite these significant cultural differences, research consistently shows that all cultures recognize the moral importance of preventing harm, promoting fairness, and protecting the vulnerable. While cultures may define harm differently, prioritize different types of fairness, and identify different groups as deserving protection, the underlying moral concerns remain universal. This suggests that moral dialogue across cultures is possible when we focus on shared underlying values rather than getting trapped in debates about surface differences. For example, both honor cultures and dignity cultures care about protecting people from unjust treatment, even though they may disagree about what constitutes unjust treatment and how to respond to it. Both individual-focused and collective-focused cultures care about human welfare, even though they may disagree about whether individual freedom or social harmony is more important for achieving that welfare. By identifying these shared concerns, we can work toward moral understanding even across significant cultural differences. Part 6. Moral Reasoning Frameworks. When we face difficult moral decisions, especially those involving conflicting values or uncertain consequences, we need systematic approaches to help us think clearly and consistently. Philosophers have developed several powerful frameworks for moral reasoning that can guide us through complex ethical terrain. These frameworks do not provide easy answers to moral questions, but they help us ask the right questions and consider all the relevant factors before making decisions. Learning to use multiple moral frameworks makes us better moral decision-makers, because different approaches often highlight different aspects of moral problems that we might otherwise overlook. The consequentialist framework focuses on the outcomes or results of our actions. According to this approach, an action is morally right if it produces the best possible consequences for everyone affected. The most famous version of consequentialism is utilitarianism, which holds that we should act to maximize overall happiness or well-being and minimize suffering. When using consequentialist reasoning, you ask questions like, what are all the possible outcomes of different actions? Who will be affected by each possible outcome, and how? Which action will produce the greatest good for the greatest number of people? This framework is particularly useful for policy decisions, resource allocation, and other situations where we need to weigh the interests of many different people. However, pure consequentialism can sometimes recommend actions that violate our deepest moral intuitions, such as punishing innocent people if doing so would deter crime and reduce overall suffering. The deontological framework focuses on the inherent rightness or wrongness of actions themselves, regardless of their consequences. According to this approach, some actions are simply right or wrong because of the kind of actions they are, not because of what they lead to. The most influential deontological theory was developed by the German philosopher Immanuel Kant, who argued that moral actions must be based on principles that we could rationally will everyone to follow. When using deontological reasoning, you ask questions like, what moral rule or principle does this action follow? Would I want everyone in similar situations to act the same way? Does this action treat people as ends in themselves, with inherent dignity and worth, or merely as means to achieve other goals? This framework helps us recognize that some actions may be wrong, even if they produce good consequences, such as lying to people for their own good or breaking promises when it might be convenient. However, pure deontological thinking can sometimes be rigid and fail to account for the real-world complexity of moral situations. The virtue ethics framework focuses on moral character rather than specific actions or consequences. According to this approach, the key question is not what action to take in a particular situation, but what kind of person to be and what a person of good character would do. Virtue ethics emphasizes the development of moral qualities like courage, honesty, compassion, justice, temperance, and wisdom. When using virtue-based reasoning, you ask questions like, what would a person of excellent character do in this situation? How can I develop the moral qualities that will help me respond well to future challenges? What kind of person do I want to become through my choices and actions? This framework is particularly valuable for long-term moral development and for situations where rules and consequences provide insufficient guidance. However, virtue ethics can sometimes be vague about what to do in specific situations, and different cultures may emphasize different virtues as most important. The care ethics framework emphasizes relationships, emotional connections, and the particular needs of individuals rather than abstract principles or universal rules. According to this approach, moral reasoning should focus on maintaining and strengthening relationships while responding to the specific needs of particular people in their unique circumstances. Care ethics often emphasizes qualities like empathy, responsiveness, attentiveness, and responsibility. When using care-based reasoning, you ask questions like, how will different actions affect the relationships involved? What do the specific people in this situation actually need, and how can I best respond to those needs? How can I act in ways that strengthen rather than damage important relationships? This framework is particularly valuable for personal relationships, family decisions, and caregiving situations. However, care ethics can sometimes lead to favoritism or neglect of broader social justice concerns. The most effective moral reasoning often involves using multiple frameworks together rather than relying on just one approach. Different moral frameworks can highlight different aspects of complex situations and help us avoid the blind spots that come from using only one type of moral thinking. A decision that seems clearly right from a consequentialist perspective might raise troubling questions when viewed through a deontological lens, and these tensions can help us think more carefully about what we are really doing and why. The goal is not to find the one framework that always gives the right answer, but to develop the skill of moral reasoning that allows us to navigate complex ethical terrain with wisdom, humility, and integrity. Part 7. The development of moral judgment. Human moral development is a lifelong journey that begins in infancy and continues throughout our lives. Understanding how moral judgment develops can help us become better moral decision-makers and better guides for the young people in our lives. Research shows that moral development involves both emotional and cognitive components that mature at different rates and interact in complex ways. Children are not simply small adults who need to learn moral rules, but developing beings whose capacity for moral reasoning grows and changes in predictable patterns. The earliest signs of moral development appear surprisingly early in human life. Infants as young as 6 months old show preferences for characters who help others over characters who harm others, suggesting that the foundations of moral judgment are present before language or explicit reasoning develop. Toddlers spontaneously comfort others in distress, share resources with friends, and show signs of guilt when they break rules or hurt others. These early moral emotions and behaviors appear across cultures and even in children with limited social experience, suggesting that humans enter the world with a natural readiness for moral development. However, these early moral capacities are limited in scope and often focused on immediate relationships and concrete situations rather than abstract principles or distant others. The challenge of moral development is expanding these natural moral emotions and intuitions into more sophisticated and comprehensive moral reasoning. The influential psychologist Lawrence Kohlberg identified 3 major levels of moral development that people progress through as they mature. The first level, which he called pre-conventional morality, focuses on avoiding punishment and obtaining rewards. Children at this level think that actions are right if they avoid getting in trouble and wrong if they lead to punishment. While this may seem like a primitive form of moral thinking, it actually serves important functions in helping children learn social rules and understand that their actions have consequences. The second level, conventional morality, focuses on social approval and maintaining social order. People at this level think that actions are right if they conform to social expectations and wrong if they violate social norms. Much adult moral reasoning operates at this level, as people try to be good citizens, loyal friends, and responsible family members. The third level, post-conventional morality, focuses on universal principles and abstract values that may sometimes conflict with social conventions. People at this level think that actions are right if they uphold fundamental principles like justice, human rights, and human dignity, even when doing so requires challenging popular opinion or established authority. Only a minority of adults consistently reach this level, and even they may reason at lower levels in some situations. However, more recent research has revealed that moral development is more complex and variable than Kohlberg's original theory suggested. Different types of moral reasoning may develop at different rates and in different contexts. A person might use sophisticated reasoning about fairness and justice, while still thinking in simple terms about loyalty and authority. Cultural factors also play a much larger role in moral development than Kohlberg initially recognized. Children growing up in different cultural contexts learn to emphasize different moral values and reasoning styles, though they all seem to develop some capacity for moral judgment. Additionally, moral development is not a simple progression from bad to good, but rather an expansion and refinement of moral capacities that continues throughout life. One of the most important insights from developmental research is that moral education involves much more than teaching rules or providing information about right and wrong. Children learn moral values primarily through relationships, experiences, and modeling, rather than through lectures or abstract discussions. They need opportunities to practice moral reasoning, to make mistakes and learn from them, and to see how moral principles apply in real situations. They also need emotional support and guidance as they navigate the complex feelings that accompany moral development, including guilt, empathy, moral anger, and the desire to do right. Adults who want to promote moral development in young people should focus on creating environments that encourage moral reflection, provide opportunities for moral action, and model the kind of moral reasoning and behavior they hope to see. This means being willing to discuss difficult moral questions, to admit when we are uncertain or have made mistakes, and to demonstrate that moral reasoning is an ongoing process rather than a fixed set of answers. Part 8. Social influences on morality. While we often think of morality as a matter of individual choice and personal character, our moral judgments and behavior are profoundly shaped by the social contexts in which we find ourselves. Understanding these social influences can help us make better moral decisions and create environments that bring out the best, rather than the worst in human moral nature. Some of the most disturbing events in human history have occurred not because people were individually evil, but because social situations overwhelmed individual moral judgment and encouraged destructive behavior. Conversely, some of the most inspiring examples of moral courage have occurred when individuals found ways to resist destructive social pressures and act according to their moral convictions despite significant personal costs. One of the most powerful social influences on moral behavior is the pressure to conform to group norms and expectations. Classic psychological experiments have demonstrated that people will often go along with group judgments even when they can clearly see that the group is wrong. This conformity pressure becomes even stronger when the issues involved are moral rather than factual, because challenging the group's moral judgments can feel like challenging your entire social identity and belonging. People may engage in behaviours they would normally consider wrong, or fail to intervene when they witness wrongdoing, simply because everyone else seems to accept the situation as normal. This conformity pressure can lead to moral disasters when groups develop norms that permit or encourage harmful behaviour. But it can also support moral behaviour when groups have strong norms against wrongdoing. Understanding conformity pressure can help us recognise when we might be going along with something wrong simply because others are doing it, and it can motivate us to create social environments with strong moral norms. Another major social influence on morality is the diffusion of responsibility that occurs in groups. When we are alone and witness someone in need of help, we feel a clear responsibility to act. But when we are part of a group witnessing the same situation, each individual feels less personal responsibility because the responsibility is spread across all group members. This diffusion of responsibility can lead to situations where everyone assumes someone else will act, with the result that no one acts and harm occurs that could have been prevented. The bystander effect, as psychologists call this phenomenon, helps explain why people sometimes fail to help victims of crime, intervene in bullying situations, or speak up against organizational wrongdoing. Recognizing this tendency can help us take personal responsibility even when we are part of a group, and it can help us structure groups in ways that encourage rather than discourage moral action. Authority relationships create another powerful social influence on moral behavior. People have a natural tendency to obey legitimate authority, which serves important social functions but can also lead to moral problems when authorities abuse their power or make immoral demands. Classic experiments by Stanley Milgram showed that ordinary people would inflict what they believed to be severe pain on innocent victims when instructed to do so by an authority figure in a scientific setting. More recent research has confirmed that people often suppress their moral judgments when acting under orders, even when those orders conflict with their personal moral convictions. This tendency to defer to authority helps explain how ordinary people become complicit in organizational wrongdoing, police brutality, military atrocities, and other forms of institutionalized harm. However, it also helps explain how moral leaders can inspire others to act with courage and compassion beyond what they might manage on their own. The social identity of groups also profoundly shapes moral judgment and behavior. People tend to apply different moral standards to members of their own groups than to outsiders, showing greater empathy, forgiveness, and concern for the welfare of in-group members. This in-group favoritism can lead to moral blindness about the wrongdoing of group members and excessive punishment of outsiders for similar behavior. It can also create moral disengagement, where people convince themselves that normal moral standards do not apply when dealing with outsiders who are seen as threatening or inferior. On the other hand, expanding our sense of group identity to include previously excluded others is one of the most powerful ways to extend moral concern and promote moral progress. Throughout history, moral advancement has often involved recognizing the full humanity and moral worth of people who were previously seen as outsiders, inferiors, or enemies. Understanding these social influences does not excuse immoral behavior, but it does help us recognize that creating moral societies requires more than just teaching individuals to be good. We also need to design social institutions, group norms, and authority structures that support moral behavior rather than undermining it. This means creating systems of accountability that prevent the diffusion of responsibility, establishing clear ethical guidelines that help people resist inappropriate authority, and fostering inclusive identities that extend moral concern across group boundaries. It also means recognizing that we are all vulnerable to social pressures that can compromise our moral judgment, and therefore we need to actively work to create social environments that bring out our better angels rather than our worst impulses. Part 9. Practical decision-making tools. When faced with real moral dilemmas, we need practical tools that can help us move from understanding moral theory to making good decisions in complex situations. These tools are not mechanical formulas that automatically produce right answers, but structured approaches that help us think systematically about moral problems and avoid common pitfalls in moral reasoning. The most effective moral decision-making combines careful analysis with emotional wisdom, principled reasoning with attention to context, and individual reflection with consultation with others. Learning to use these tools requires practice, just like any other skill, but they can dramatically improve the quality of our moral decisions over time. The first step in effective moral decision-making is recognizing that you are facing a moral issue in the first place. This may sound obvious, but many moral failures occur not because people choose wrongly, but because they fail to recognize moral dimensions of situations until it is too late. We can become so focused on practical, legal, or financial considerations that we overlook the moral implications of our choices. Warning signs that you may be facing a moral issue include feeling uncomfortable about a situation even when you cannot articulate why, discovering that different stakeholders have conflicting interests, realizing that your decision could significantly help or harm others, or finding yourself rationalizing behavior that you would normally consider questionable. Developing moral sensitivity means learning to notice these warning signs and taking them seriously even when addressing moral concerns might be inconvenient or costly. Once you recognize that you are facing a moral issue, you can begin to address it systematically rather than stumbling into moral problems through inattention. The second step is gathering relevant information about the situation, including facts about what happened, who is affected, what the likely consequences of different actions might be, and what values and principles are at stake. Many moral mistakes result from making decisions based on incomplete or inaccurate information. This fact-gathering process should include consulting with people who have different perspectives on the situation, particularly those who might be affected by your decision. It should also include examining your own motivations and biases that might be influencing how you see the situation. Are you being influenced by self-interest, loyalty to friends, pressure from authorities, or other factors that might distort your moral judgment? Are you making assumptions about other people's motivations or circumstances that you should check? Taking time to gather information and examine your own perspective can help you avoid moral decisions that you will later regret when you learn more about the situation. However, you should also recognize that you will never have perfect information, and sometimes moral action requires making decisions under uncertainty. The third step is identifying your options and thinking creatively about possible responses to the moral problem. Many people get stuck in moral dilemmas because they see only two choices, often both of which seem problematic. But most moral situations offer more options than are immediately apparent, and creative thinking can often reveal solutions that address multiple moral concerns simultaneously. This might involve consulting with others who have faced similar situations, researching how comparable problems have been handled in other contexts, or simply taking time to brainstorm alternative approaches. Sometimes the best moral response involves changing the situation rather than choosing between existing options. For example, if you discover that your organization is engaged in harmful practices, your choices might not be limited to staying silent or blowing the whistle. You might be able to work within the organization to change the practices, find allies who share your concerns, or gradually document problems while looking for more effective ways to address them. The key is to avoid premature closure on your options and to think creatively about how you might address the moral problems you have identified. The fourth step is evaluating your options using the moral frameworks we discussed earlier, while also considering practical constraints and likely consequences. This evaluation should include considering how each option measures up according to consequentialist reasoning about outcomes, deontological reasoning about principles and duties, virtue ethics reasoning about character, and care ethics reasoning about relationships. You should also consider how each option fits with your own deepest values and commitments, as well as how it might be viewed by people you respect and trust. This process often reveals that different moral frameworks point in different directions, creating genuine moral complexity that cannot be resolved through simple formulas. When this happens, you need to use your best judgment to weigh competing moral considerations while acknowledging that reasonable people might reach different conclusions. You should also consider practical factors like your own capabilities, resources, and likely effectiveness in implementing different options. An ideal moral response that you cannot actually carry out is less valuable than a good moral response that you can implement effectively. The goal is to find the best response that you can actually execute given your real-world constraints and capabilities. The final step is implementing your decision and then reflecting on the results to learn from the experience. Even the best moral reasoning is worthless if it does not lead to action, and taking moral action often requires courage, persistence and skill in addition to good judgment. You may need to prepare for resistance, criticism, or other challenges that come with doing the right thing in difficult situations. After you act, you should pay attention to the actual consequences of your decision and compare them with what you expected. Did your action have the effects you intended, or were there unexpected results that you should consider in future situations? What did you learn about yourself, about the situation, or about moral decision-making that might help you handle similar problems more effectively in the future? This reflection process helps you continue developing your moral judgment and prepares you to handle future moral challenges with greater wisdom and skill. Remember that moral development is a lifelong process, and even experienced moral decision-makers continue learning from their mistakes and successes. Part 10. Living with Moral Complexity. As we reach the end of our exploration of right and wrong, it is important to acknowledge that moral life involves ongoing complexity, uncertainty, and the need for continued learning and growth. There are no simple formulas that can resolve all moral dilemmas, and even people of goodwill and careful reasoning sometimes reach different conclusions about difficult moral questions. This complexity is not a weakness of moral thinking, but an inevitable result of the richness and complexity of human life itself. Learning to live with moral complexity while still maintaining clear moral commitments is one of the most important skills for ethical living in the modern world. One source of moral complexity is the fact that most real-world situations involve multiple competing values that cannot all be fully satisfied simultaneously. For example, telling the truth is generally morally important, but there are situations where honesty might cause unnecessary harm to vulnerable people. Treating people equally is a fundamental moral principle, but there are situations where equal treatment might perpetuate unfair disadvantages or fail to address legitimate special needs. Respecting individual freedom is crucial for human dignity, but there are situations where unlimited freedom for some individuals restricts the freedom of others or causes collective harm. These value conflicts are not problems to be solved once and for all, but ongoing tensions that require careful judgment and contextual wisdom. The goal is not to eliminate these tensions, but to navigate them thoughtfully, and to develop the skills needed to balance competing values in specific situations. Another source of complexity is the fact that our moral knowledge and understanding continue to evolve over time. Practices that were once widely accepted as morally permissible are now recognized as wrong, and moral principles that were once limited to narrow groups have been extended to include previously excluded people. This moral progress suggests that our current moral beliefs, no matter how carefully reasoned, may also be incomplete or mistaken in ways that we do not yet recognize. This should make us humble about our moral judgments while not abandoning our commitment to acting according to our best current understanding of right and wrong. It also suggests that we should remain open to moral learning, willing to reconsider our views when presented with new evidence or arguments, and committed to the ongoing project of moral improvement both individually and collectively. Moral humility does not mean moral relativism, but rather the recognition that moral knowledge, like all knowledge, is provisional and subject to revision based on better reasoning and evidence. The existence of moral complexity also means that we need to develop tolerance for moral disagreement while maintaining our own moral convictions. In a diverse society, people with different backgrounds, experiences and values will sometimes reach different conclusions about moral questions, even when they are all reasoning carefully and in good faith. This does not mean that all moral views are equally valid, or that moral truth is simply a matter of opinion. Some moral disagreements can be resolved through better reasoning, more complete information, or deeper understanding of shared values. But other moral disagreements may persist even among thoughtful and well-informed people, particularly when they involve complex questions about how to balance competing values or how to apply moral principles in novel situations. Learning to engage respectfully with people who hold different moral views while still maintaining confidence in our own carefully considered moral judgments is essential for living in a pluralistic society. Perhaps most importantly, living with moral complexity requires accepting that moral life is an ongoing practice rather than a problem to be solved. We do not graduate from moral development or reach a point where we no longer need to think carefully about right and wrong. Instead, we continue throughout our lives to face new moral challenges, to refine our understanding of moral principles, and to develop our skills in moral reasoning and moral action. This ongoing nature of moral life means that moral education should not focus only on teaching fixed rules or final answers, but on developing the capacities needed for lifelong moral learning and growth. These capacities include moral sensitivity that helps us recognize moral issues, moral reasoning skills that help us think clearly about complex problems, moral imagination that helps us envision creative solutions, and moral courage that helps us act on our convictions, even when doing so is difficult or costly. By developing these capacities and committing to their ongoing use, we can live lives of moral integrity even in the face of uncertainty and complexity. The journey through understanding right and wrong ultimately leads us back to ourselves and our relationships with others. Morality is not an abstract philosophical system, but a lived reality that shapes how we treat each other and what kind of world we create together. The insights from science, philosophy and human experience that we have explored provide us with tools for moral thinking, but they cannot substitute for the ongoing work of moral reflection, moral conversation and moral action that each of us must undertake. This work is challenging but also deeply rewarding, as it connects us with our deepest values and with our shared humanity. By taking morality seriously, we honor both our individual dignity and our collective responsibility for creating a world where all people can flourish. This is perhaps the most important work that any of us can do, and it is work that belongs to each and every one of us. Part 11. Moral emotions in everyday life. The moral emotions that we experience throughout each day shape our character and relationships in ways that most people never consciously notice. These emotions serve as an internal compass, guiding us toward right action and warning us when we are moving in the wrong direction. Understanding how to recognize, interpret and respond to moral emotions can dramatically improve our ethical decision-making and our relationships with others. These emotions are not just private psychological experiences, but powerful forces that connect us to the moral fabric of our communities and to our shared human values. Moral elevation is one of the most inspiring moral emotions, yet it is also one of the least understood. This is the warm, uplifting feeling we experience when we witness acts of exceptional virtue, kindness, or moral beauty. When you see someone help a stranger in need, stand up for someone being bullied, or sacrifice their own interests for a greater good, you may feel a physical sensation of warmth in your chest, a desire to be a better person yourself, and increased motivation to help others. Research shows that experiencing moral elevation actually makes people more likely to engage in prosocial behavior themselves, creating a ripple effect of moral inspiration that can spread through communities. This suggests that seeking out stories, experiences and role models that inspire moral elevation is not just personally enriching, but socially beneficial. We can cultivate moral elevation by paying attention to the everyday heroes around us, by reading stories of moral courage and compassion, and by deliberately seeking out opportunities to witness human goodness in action. Moral disappointment and disillusionment represent the flip side of moral elevation, and learning to handle these emotions constructively is crucial for maintaining moral motivation over time. When we discover that someone we admired has acted immorally, when institutions we trusted betray their stated values, or when our own moral efforts seem to have little impact, we may feel profound disappointment that can lead to cynicism and moral disengagement. These feelings are natural and appropriate responses to genuine moral failures, but they become destructive when they lead us to conclude that morality itself is meaningless, or that moral effort is futile. The key is learning to maintain commitment to moral values, even when people and institutions fail to live up to those values. This requires distinguishing between the imperfect people who carry moral values and the values themselves, which remain important regardless of how well or poorly they are implemented in any particular case. It also requires developing realistic expectations about moral progress, recognizing that moral advancement is typically slow, uneven, and subject to setbacks rather than a steady march toward perfection. Moral pride is a complex emotion that can either support or undermine ethical behavior depending on how it is experienced and expressed. Healthy moral pride involves feeling good about living up to your own moral standards and contributing to the welfare of others. This type of pride reinforces moral behavior and helps maintain motivation for continued ethical action. However, moral pride can become destructive when it turns into self-righteousness, moral superiority, or contempt for people who have different moral views or who have made moral mistakes. Self-righteous pride often leads to harsh judgment of others, unwillingness to acknowledge our own moral failures, and resistance to moral learning and growth. The antidote to destructive moral pride is humility about our own moral limitations, combined with compassion for the moral struggles that all people face. We can feel good about our moral efforts and achievements while still recognizing that we have much to learn, and that other people may have insights and experiences that can help us become better. This balance between moral confidence and moral humility is essential for both personal moral development and constructive moral dialogue with others. Moral anxiety and uncertainty are increasingly common in our complex modern world, where traditional moral guidance may seem inadequate for addressing novel ethical challenges. Many people experience significant stress when facing moral decisions, particularly when different moral considerations point in different directions, or when the consequences of different choices are uncertain. This moral anxiety can be paralyzing if it prevents us from taking action when action is needed, but it can also be a valuable signal that we are taking moral decisions seriously and considering their full complexity. Learning to tolerate moral uncertainty while still taking decisive action when necessary is a crucial skill for ethical living. This requires developing comfort with the fact that we cannot always know for certain what the right action is, but we can still act according to our best judgment based on careful moral reasoning and our deepest values. It also requires recognizing that taking imperfect action is often better than taking no action at all, particularly when others are depending on us or when delay itself has moral consequences. Part 12. The role of moral imagination. Moral imagination is the capacity to envision alternative possibilities, to understand situations from multiple perspectives, and to create new solutions to moral problems. This often overlooked aspect of moral thinking may be just as important as moral reasoning and moral emotion for addressing the complex ethical challenges we face. Many moral failures occur not because people lack good intentions or sound principles, but because they cannot imagine better ways of responding to difficult situations. Conversely, many of the greatest moral advances in history have come from people who could envision possibilities that others could not see, and who had the creativity to develop new approaches to persistent moral problems. The first function of moral imagination is helping us understand the experiences and perspectives of people who are different from ourselves. Much moral wrongdoing stems from a failure to recognize or appreciate how our actions affect others, particularly those whose experiences differ significantly from our own. Moral imagination allows us to step outside our own limited perspective and consider how situations look and feel to people in different circumstances. This imaginative empathy is particularly important for addressing issues of social justice, where privileged groups may struggle to understand the experiences of marginalized communities. Developing moral imagination requires actively seeking out stories, experiences, and perspectives that challenge our assumptions about what life is like for other people. This might involve reading literature by authors from different backgrounds, listening to the lived experiences of people facing different challenges, or simply paying more careful attention to how our actions affect others in our daily lives. Moral imagination also helps us envision alternative ways of organizing social relationships and institutions that might better serve human flourishing. Many of our current social arrangements seem natural and inevitable, but they are actually human creations that could be changed if we can imagine better alternatives. Throughout history, moral progress has often required people who could imagine societies without slavery, without the subordination of women, without the exclusion of minority groups, or without the acceptance of extreme poverty and inequality. These visionaries faced ridicule and resistance from people who could not imagine that things could be different, but their moral imagination ultimately helped transform society for the better. Today, we need moral imagination to address contemporary challenges like climate change, technological disruption, global inequality, and political polarization. These problems cannot be solved simply by applying traditional moral principles in traditional ways, but require creative thinking about new forms of cooperation, new institutional arrangements, and new ways of balancing individual and collective interests. Creative problem-solving represents another crucial function of moral imagination in everyday ethical decision-making. When we face moral dilemmas that seem to offer only bad choices, moral imagination can help us discover options that we had not previously considered. This might involve reframing the problem, changing the context, or finding ways to address multiple moral concerns simultaneously rather than choosing between them. For example, if you discover that a friend is engaged in harmful behavior, your choices might seem limited to either confronting them directly, which could damage your relationship, or staying silent, which could enable continued harm. But moral imagination might suggest other possibilities, such as gradually introducing your friend to people or experiences that might change their perspective, finding allies who share your concerns, or addressing the underlying causes that led to the harmful behavior in the first place. The key is to avoid premature closure on your options, and to think creatively about how the situation might be transformed, rather than simply choosing between existing alternatives. Moral imagination can be cultivated through various practices and experiences that expand our capacity to think creatively about moral issues. Reading literature, particularly fiction that explores complex moral situations and diverse human experiences, can help us develop greater sensitivity to moral nuance and possibility. Engaging with the arts more broadly, including theatre, film, visual arts and music, can expose us to different ways of understanding human experience and moral relationships. Travel and cross-cultural experience, even within our own communities, can challenge our assumptions about how social life must be organized and what possibilities exist for human cooperation. Deliberate practice in creative thinking, such as brainstorming alternative solutions to problems or imagining how situations might be different, can strengthen our capacity for moral imagination over time. Perhaps most importantly, cultivating curiosity about other people's experiences and maintaining openness to the possibility that things could be better than they currently are provides the foundation for moral imagination to flourish. Part 13. Moral Leadership and Influence. Every person has opportunities to provide moral leadership and influence within their own spheres of activity, whether in families, workplaces, communities, or other social contexts. Moral leadership does not require formal authority or public recognition, but it does require the courage to stand up for moral principles and the skill to influence others in positive directions. Understanding how moral influence works and how to exercise it effectively is crucial for anyone who wants to contribute to moral progress in their community and beyond. The most effective moral leaders combine clear moral vision with practical wisdom about how to motivate and guide others toward better choices and better systems. Moral leadership begins with personal integrity and the consistent alignment of actions with stated values. People are much more likely to be influenced by those who demonstrate moral consistency in their own lives than by those who advocate moral standards that they do not themselves follow. This does not mean that moral leaders must be perfect, but it does mean that they must be honest about their own moral struggles and committed to continuous moral growth. When moral leaders make mistakes, they acknowledge them honestly, make appropriate amends, and demonstrate what it looks like to learn from moral failures. This modelling of moral accountability and growth is often more influential than preaching about moral principles in the abstract. People learn more from what they see others do than from what they hear others say, so moral leaders must be willing to live the values they advocate. Effective moral influence also requires understanding the motivations, concerns, and perspectives of the people you hope to influence. Different people are motivated by different moral considerations, and approaches that work well with some individuals or groups may be ineffective or even counterproductive with others. Some people are primarily motivated by consequences and practical outcomes, while others are more concerned with principles and duties. Some people are more responsive to emotional appeals about relationships and care, while others prefer logical arguments about fairness and rights. Effective moral leaders learn to frame moral arguments in ways that connect with the existing values and concerns of their audience, rather than simply asserting their own preferred moral framework. This requires listening carefully to understand how others think about moral issues and finding common ground that can serve as a foundation for moral dialogue and persuasion. The timing and context of moral influence attempts are also crucial factors in their effectiveness. People are more open to moral influence when they are not feeling defensive, threatened, or under pressure to make immediate decisions. Confronting someone about moral issues in public when they are stressed or when they have already committed to a particular course of action is likely to provoke resistance rather than openness. More effective approaches often involve creating safe spaces for moral reflection, providing time for people to process moral information, and offering support rather than criticism when people are struggling with moral decisions. Sometimes the most effective moral influence happens through patient relationship building over time, rather than through dramatic confrontations or urgent appeals. Building trust and demonstrating genuine care for others' welfare creates the foundation for moral influence that can be drawn upon when specific moral issues arise. Moral leaders also understand the importance of creating systems and structures that make moral behavior easier and immoral behavior more difficult. Individual moral exhortation can be effective in some situations, but lasting moral change often requires changing the institutional and social contexts that shape behavior. This might involve establishing clear ethical guidelines and accountability mechanisms in organizations, creating incentive structures that reward moral behavior and discourage wrongdoing, or building social norms that make certain behaviors socially unacceptable. For example, reducing drunk driving required not just individual education about the dangers of driving under the influence, but also changes in laws, enforcement practices, social norms, and institutional policies that made drunk driving both more difficult and more socially stigmatized. Effective moral leaders think strategically about how to create environmental changes that support the moral behavior they want to encourage. This systemic approach to moral influence recognizes that individual character and choice remain important, but that character and choice are significantly shaped by the social and institutional contexts in which people find themselves. Part 14. Technology and Modern Moral Challenges. The rapid pace of technological change in the 21st century has created moral challenges that previous generations could never have imagined. Artificial intelligence, social media, genetic engineering, surveillance technologies, automation, and other innovations are transforming human life in ways that raise fundamental questions about privacy, autonomy, justice, and human flourishing. These technological developments are not morally neutral, but embed values and assumptions that shape how we relate to each other and what kinds of lives become possible. Understanding the moral dimensions of technology and learning to guide technological development in morally beneficial directions has become one of the most important ethical challenges of our time. Artificial intelligence represents perhaps the most significant moral challenge posed by emerging technology. As AI systems become more sophisticated and are deployed in more areas of human life, they are making decisions that have profound effects on individuals and communities. AI algorithms determine who gets loans, who gets hired for jobs, who receives medical treatment, who gets released from prison, and who gets targeted for marketing or surveillance. These decisions can perpetuate or amplify existing biases and inequalities, particularly when AI systems are trained on historical data that reflects past discrimination. Additionally, as AI systems become more autonomous, questions arise about who is responsible when these systems cause harm and how we can ensure that they operate according to human values rather than optimizing for narrow metrics that may not align with human welfare. The development of artificial general intelligence that might exceed human capabilities in most areas raises even deeper questions about the future of human agency and the distribution of power in society. Social media and digital communication technologies have transformed how we form relationships, share information, and participate in public discourse, with significant moral implications that we are only beginning to understand. These platforms can connect people across vast distances and enable new forms of cooperation and mutual support, but they can also facilitate harassment, misinformation, and political manipulation. The business models of many social media companies create incentives for engagement and attention that may conflict with truthfulness, civility, and mental health. Algorithmic curation of information can create filter bubbles and echo chambers that reinforce existing beliefs and increase polarization rather than promoting understanding across different perspectives. The anonymity and distance possible in digital communication can reduce empathy and accountability, making it easier for people to treat others in ways they would never consider acceptable in face-to-face interactions. These challenges require both individual moral reflection about how we use digital technologies and collective action to shape these platforms in ways that support rather than undermine human flourishing. Genetic engineering and biotechnology raise profound questions about the boundaries of acceptable human intervention in natural processes and the distribution of genetic advantages and disadvantages. The ability to edit genes to prevent genetic diseases seems clearly beneficial, but the same technologies could potentially be used to enhance human capabilities in ways that might create new forms of inequality between the genetically enhanced and unenhanced. Questions arise about whether parents have the right or even the obligation to genetically improve their children, whether genetic modifications should be available only to those who can afford them, and how genetic interventions might affect human identity and social relationships. Similar moral complexities surround other biotechnologies, such as reproductive technologies that enable new forms of family formation, life extension technologies that might dramatically increase human lifespan, and brain-computer interfaces that could blur the boundaries between human and machine intelligence. These technologies offer tremendous potential benefits, but they also require careful moral reflection about their appropriate uses and the kind of society we want to create through their deployment. The decisions we make about these technologies today will shape the options available to future generations and the kind of world they inherit. Privacy and surveillance represent another area where technological capabilities are advancing faster than our moral and legal frameworks for governing their use. Digital technologies make it possible to collect, store, and analyze vast amounts of information about individuals, behavior, preferences, relationships, and activities. This information can be used for beneficial purposes, such as improving medical care, enhancing safety, or providing personalized services, but it can also be used for manipulation, discrimination, or social control. The challenge is developing principles and practices that protect individual privacy and autonomy, while still allowing for the beneficial uses of data and technology. This requires thinking carefully about what kinds of information should be considered private, under what circumstances surveillance might be justified, and how to ensure that individuals maintain meaningful control over their personal information. It also requires international cooperation to govern technologies that cross national boundaries and long-term thinking about the cumulative effects of surveillance on social trust and human freedom. Part 15. Environmental Ethics and Future Generations. Our relationship with the natural environment raises some of the most challenging moral questions of our time, particularly because environmental decisions today will have consequences that extend far beyond our own lifetimes. Climate change, biodiversity loss, pollution, resource depletion, and other environmental problems require us to think about moral obligations that extend across space and time in unprecedented ways. We must consider our responsibilities not only to people in distant places who are affected by our environmental choices, but also to future generations who will inherit the consequences of decisions made today. Environmental ethics challenges traditional moral frameworks that focus primarily on direct relationships between identifiable individuals and asks us to consider our obligations to abstract future people and to non-human nature itself. The moral significance of climate change stems not only from its massive scale and potentially catastrophic consequences, but also from the way it highlights tensions between individual freedom and collective responsibility. The greenhouse gas emissions that drive climate change result from billions of individual decisions about transportation, consumption, energy use, and lifestyle choices. Each individual contribution to climate change is tiny and seemingly insignificant, yet the collective impact of all these individual choices is enormous and potentially devastating for future generations. This creates a moral puzzle about individual responsibility for collective outcomes and raises questions about what we owe to people we will never meet, who will live in a world shaped by our choices. Some argue that individual actions are meaningless in the face of such a massive collective problem, and that only large-scale political and economic changes can address climate change effectively. Others maintain that individual responsibility remains important both as a matter of moral integrity and as a contribution to the cultural changes that make political solutions possible. Our obligations to future generations raise particularly complex questions because we cannot know exactly what future people will value or what their needs and capabilities will be. We know that our environmental choices today will significantly affect the options available to people who live 50 or 100 years from now, but we cannot predict precisely what those effects will be or how future generations will experience them. Should we focus on preserving specific natural environments and species that we value today, or should we try to maximize the overall flexibility and resources available to future people to address whatever challenges they face? How do we balance investments in environmental protection against other pressing current needs, particularly given that many people around the world still lack access to basic necessities like clean water adequate food, and medical care. These questions require us to think carefully about what we owe to future generations and how to weigh their interests against the needs of people who are suffering today. They also require humility about our ability to predict the future and wisdom about how to make decisions under conditions of significant uncertainty. The moral status of non-human nature represents another fundamental challenge in environmental ethics. Traditional moral frameworks have focused primarily on human welfare and human rights, treating the natural environment primarily as a resource for human use or as valuable only insofar as it contributes to human flourishing. But many environmental problems seem to require recognizing that non-human nature has moral significance in its own right, not just as a means to human ends. This might involve recognizing the rights of other species, the intrinsic value of ecosystems, or our obligations to maintain the integrity of natural processes regardless of their immediate utility to humans. However, extending moral consideration to non-human nature raises difficult questions about how to balance human needs against environmental protection, how to adjudicate conflicts between different environmental values, and how to make practical decisions about land use, resource extraction, and conservation. It also requires developing new moral vocabularies and frameworks that can accommodate the complex relationships between human and non-human nature in ways that traditional moral theories have not adequately addressed. Environmental justice adds another layer of moral complexity by highlighting how environmental harms and benefits are distributed unequally across different human communities. Poor communities and minority communities are often disproportionately affected by pollution, toxic waste, and other environmental hazards, while wealthy communities enjoy cleaner environments and greater access to natural amenities. This environmental inequality reflects and reinforces other forms of social inequality and raises questions about how environmental protection efforts can address issues of social justice as well as ecological preservation. Climate change exemplifies these environmental justice concerns. As the communities most vulnerable to sea level rise, extreme weather, and other climate impacts are often those that have contributed least to greenhouse gas emissions. Addressing environmental problems effectively requires addressing these distributional issues and ensuring that environmental policies do not worsen existing inequalities or create new forms of injustice. This means thinking about environmental protection, not just as a technical problem, but as a social justice issue that must be addressed through inclusive and equitable approaches to environmental decision-making. Part 16, Economic Ethics and Justice. Economic systems and market relationships raise fundamental questions about justice, fairness, and human flourishing that are often overlooked in discussions focused purely on efficiency and growth. How we organize economic life shapes the distribution of opportunities, resources, and life chances across society in ways that have profound moral implications. Understanding the ethical dimensions of economic relationships and learning to evaluate economic policies and practices from moral as well as practical perspectives is essential for creating societies that serve human welfare rather than simply maximizing economic output. Economic ethics requires us to think carefully about what we owe each other as participants in shared economic systems and how economic arrangements can be structured to promote justice and human flourishing. The distribution of wealth and income within societies raises some of the most contentious questions in economic ethics. While few people believe that perfect equality of outcomes is either possible or desirable, there is significant disagreement about how much inequality is morally acceptable and what moral principles should guide the distribution of economic benefits and burdens. Some argue that individuals should be free to keep whatever they can earn through their own efforts and voluntary exchanges, regardless of how unequal the resulting distribution might be. Others maintain that extreme inequality is inherently unjust, and that society has an obligation to ensure that everyone has access to the basic necessities of life, regardless of their economic productivity. Still others focus on equality of opportunity rather than equality of outcomes, arguing that what matters morally is that everyone has a fair chance to succeed, rather than that everyone actually achieves the same level of success. These different approaches reflect deeper disagreements about the relationship between individual responsibility and social obligation, the role of luck and circumstance in economic outcomes, and the purposes of economic systems. The globalization of economic activity has created new moral challenges by extending economic relationships across national boundaries and cultural differences. Products that we use every day may be produced by workers on the other side of the world under conditions that we know little about, creating complex questions about our moral responsibilities for labor practices in distant supply chains. International trade can create economic opportunities for people in developing countries, but it can also exploit workers who lack bargaining power or legal protections and cause environmental damage in communities that lack effective regulation. Consumers in wealthy countries face difficult choices about whether to pay higher prices for products that are certified as ethically produced, whether to boycott companies engaged in questionable practices, and how to balance their desire for affordable goods with their concern for workers and communities affected by global production systems. These challenges require developing new forms of moral reasoning that can address relationships of responsibility and obligation that extend across vast distances and cultural differences. They also require international cooperation to develop standards and institutions that can govern global economic relationships in morally acceptable ways. The automation of work and the changing nature of employment raise questions about the social contract between individuals and society in an economy where traditional jobs may become increasingly scarce. If technological advances eliminate many forms of human labour, how should the benefits of increased productivity be distributed across society? Should people have a right to income and social support even if they are not engaged in traditional employment? And if so, how should such support be funded and organised? What are the moral obligations of companies that benefit from automation technologies toward the workers whose jobs are eliminated by those technologies? How can societies maintain human dignity and social cohesion when work may no longer serve as the primary basis for income and social status? These questions require rethinking fundamental assumptions about the relationship between work, income, and social membership that have shaped economic thinking for centuries. Financial markets and institutions wield enormous power over economic life. Yet they often operate according to logics that prioritize short-term profits over long-term social welfare. The 2008 financial crisis demonstrated how risky and irresponsible behavior by financial institutions can impose enormous costs on the broader society, raising questions about how to structure financial systems to serve productive economic activity rather than speculation. High-frequency trading, complex financial derivatives, and other sophisticated financial instruments may contribute to market efficiency in some ways, but they can also increase instability and create opportunities for manipulation that benefit insiders at the expense of ordinary investors and consumers. The concentration of wealth and power in the financial sector raises broader questions about the political influence of economic elites and the extent to which democratic societies can maintain political equality in the face of extreme economic inequality. Addressing these challenges requires developing new approaches to financial regulation that can harness the benefits of financial innovation while protecting society from the costs of financial instability and abuse. It also requires thinking more broadly about how to structure economic institutions to serve democratic values and social welfare, rather than simply maximizing returns for investors. Part 17. Moral Education and Character Development. The development of moral character is a lifelong process that begins in early childhood and continues through all stages of life, requiring intentional effort and supportive environments to flourish. Unlike academic subjects that can be learned primarily through instruction and study, moral character develops through practice, experience and reflection in real-world situations that require moral judgment and action. Understanding how moral character develops and how to create environments that support moral growth is essential for parents, teachers, mentors, and anyone who wants to contribute to the moral development of others or themselves. Effective moral education combines intellectual understanding of moral principles with emotional development and practical experience in making moral decisions under realistic conditions. The foundation of moral character lies in the development of moral emotions and moral sensitivity that help individuals recognize moral dimensions of situations and feel motivated to act on moral concerns. Young children naturally experience empathy, guilt, and other moral emotions, but these emotions need to be nurtured and guided to develop into mature moral motivations. This emotional foundation of morality requires warm, responsive relationships with adults who model moral behavior and help children understand the connections between their actions and the welfare of others. Children learn moral values primarily through relationships and experiences rather than through abstract instruction. So the quality of their relationships with parents, teachers, and other significant adults profoundly shapes their moral development. Adults who want to support moral development in children need to provide both clear moral guidance and emotional support that helps children internalize moral values rather than simply complying with external rules. This means explaining the reasons behind moral expectations, helping children understand how their behavior affects others, and demonstrating through their own actions what it means to live according to moral principles. Moral reasoning skills represent another crucial component of moral education that must be developed alongside moral emotions and motivations. As children mature, they need to learn how to think systematically about moral problems, consider multiple perspectives, evaluate competing claims, and articulate reasons for their moral judgments. This intellectual dimension of moral development can be supported through discussions of moral dilemmas, exposure to diverse viewpoints, and practice in moral argumentation and reflection. However, moral reasoning education is most effective when it is connected to real situations that matter to students rather than abstract philosophical exercises that seem removed from their lives. Students need opportunities to grapple with genuine moral challenges in their schools, communities and peer relationships while receiving guidance and support from adults who can help them think through the implications of different choices. This might involve service learning projects, peer mediation programs, student government participation, or other activities that give young people practice in making moral decisions and taking moral action in realistic contexts. Character education approaches that focus on developing specific moral virtues like honesty, courage, compassion, and responsibility have gained popularity in many educational settings. These approaches typically involve identifying core virtues that schools and communities want to promote, creating curricula and activities designed to teach and reinforce these virtues, and establishing school cultures that recognize and reward virtuous behavior. When done well, virtue-based character education can provide clear moral guidance and help students develop habits of moral behavior that serve them throughout their lives. However, character education can also become superficial if it focuses only on compliance with rules rather than genuine moral understanding, or if it promotes particular cultural or religious values without helping students think critically about moral questions. The most effective character education approaches combine clear moral expectations with opportunities for students to explore moral questions, discuss different perspectives, and develop their own moral reasoning abilities. They also recognize that moral development is a gradual process that requires patience, support, and multiple opportunities to practice moral decision-making in safe environments where mistakes can become learning opportunities. Moral education for adults involves different challenges and opportunities than moral education for children, but it remains equally important throughout life. Adults may have well-established moral beliefs and patterns of behavior that are difficult to change, but they also have greater cognitive capacity for moral reasoning and more life experience to draw upon in moral reflection. Adult moral education often focuses on helping people recognize inconsistencies in their moral beliefs, exposing them to new perspectives that challenge their assumptions, and providing opportunities for moral growth through service, leadership, and other forms of moral engagement. Professional development programs, community service opportunities, cross-cultural experiences, and deliberate moral reflection can all contribute to continued moral growth throughout adulthood. Perhaps most importantly, adults need to recognize that moral development is never complete, and that maintaining moral growth requires ongoing effort, humility, and willingness to learn from both successes and failures. This lifelong approach to moral development helps ensure that individuals continue to grow in wisdom and character as they face new challenges and take on new responsibilities throughout their lives. Part 18. The Psychology of Moral Courage. Moral courage represents the bridge between moral knowledge and moral action, enabling individuals to act on their moral convictions, even when doing so involves personal risk or social disapproval. Understanding the psychological factors that enable or inhibit moral courage can help us develop this crucial capacity in ourselves and support it in others. Research shows that moral courage involves a complex interaction of moral sensitivity, moral judgment, moral motivation, and moral character that must all align for courageous action to occur. While some individuals seem naturally more inclined toward moral courage, it is a capacity that can be developed through practice, preparation, and the cultivation of supportive social relationships. The recognition of moral issues represents the first step toward moral courage. Yet many failures of moral courage occur because people fail to recognize moral dimensions of situations until it is too late to act effectively. We may be so focused on practical concerns, social pressures, or personal interests that we do not notice when moral principles are at stake. Developing moral sensitivity requires cultivating habits of moral attention that help us notice when our actions or the actions of others might cause harm, violate important principles, or conflict with our deepest values. This moral alertness is particularly important in organizational and institutional contexts, where moral issues may be disguised as purely technical or administrative decisions. People who consistently demonstrate moral courage often report that they developed habits of asking themselves moral questions about their daily activities and the institutional practices in which they participate. This ongoing moral reflection helps them recognize moral issues early, when there are still opportunities for effective action, rather than realizing too late that they have been complicit in wrongdoing. The costs and benefits of moral action play a crucial role in determining whether individuals will act courageously when they recognize moral issues. Moral courage often requires accepting personal costs, such as social rejection, professional retaliation, financial loss, or physical danger in order to uphold moral principles. People are more likely to accept these costs when they have strong moral convictions, supportive social relationships, and confidence in their ability to handle the consequences of moral action. They are also more likely to act courageously when they believe their actions have a reasonable chance of making a positive difference, rather than being futile gestures that accomplish nothing while imposing significant personal costs. This suggests that developing moral courage requires not only strengthening moral motivation, but also developing practical skills for effective moral action and building social support networks that can provide assistance during difficult periods. It also requires learning to accept uncertainty about outcomes while still taking action based on moral conviction, recognizing that we cannot always know in advance whether our moral efforts will succeed. Social support and social pressure represent powerful influences on moral courage that can either enable or inhibit courageous action depending on the social context. Individuals are more likely to act courageously when they are part of communities that value moral action and provide support for people who take moral risks. Conversely, they are less likely to act courageously when they are isolated, when their social groups discourage moral action, or when they fear social rejection for challenging popular but immoral practices. This highlights the importance of building social movements and institutional cultures that support rather than discourage moral courage. Organizations and communities that want to promote moral courage need to create systems that protect people who report wrongdoing, reward those who take moral risks, and establish clear expectations that moral concerns should take precedence over other considerations when they conflict. They also need to provide practical support such as legal assistance, financial help, or alternative employment opportunities for people who face retaliation for moral action. The development of moral courage can be supported through various practices and experiences that help individuals prepare for moral challenges before they arise. Mental rehearsal and scenario planning can help people think through how they would respond to different types of moral challenges and identify potential obstacles to moral action. Learning from the experiences of moral exemplars and studying historical cases of moral courage can provide inspiration and practical guidance for handling difficult moral situations. Developing skills in communication, conflict resolution and strategic thinking can increase confidence and effectiveness in moral action. Perhaps most importantly, practicing moral courage in small, low-risk situations can help build the habits and confidence needed to act courageously when the stakes are higher. This might involve speaking up about minor instances of unfairness, refusing to participate in gossip or discrimination, or taking stands on local issues that matter to the community. By building moral courage gradually through practice in safer contexts, individuals can develop the capacity to act courageously when faced with more serious moral challenges that require greater personal risk and sacrifice. This developmental approach to moral courage recognizes that heroic moral action usually builds on a foundation of smaller moral choices that prepare individuals for larger moral challenges. Part 19. Forgiveness and moral repair. When moral failures occur, whether in personal relationships or broader social contexts, the process of moral repair becomes crucial for restoring trust, healing relationships, and moving forward constructively. Forgiveness represents one of the most complex and powerful aspects of moral life, involving the deliberate choice to let go of resentment and the desire for revenge while working toward reconciliation and restored relationships. Understanding how forgiveness works, when it is appropriate, and how to engage in genuine moral repair can help us respond more effectively to the inevitable moral failures that occur in human relationships. Forgiveness is not about excusing wrongdoing or pretending that harm did not occur, but about finding ways to break cycles of resentment and retaliation that can perpetuate harm across generations. Genuine forgiveness requires acknowledging the reality and seriousness of moral wrongdoing rather than minimizing or dismissing it. When someone has been harmed by the actions of another, their anger and resentment are often appropriate and justified responses that reflect legitimate moral concerns about fairness and respect. Forgiveness does not require victims to suppress these feelings or pretend that they were not really harmed, but rather involves the gradual process of working through these emotions toward a different relationship with the wrongdoer. This process often takes considerable time and may require multiple attempts before genuine forgiveness is achieved. Premature forgiveness that occurs before the victim has fully processed their experience, or before the wrongdoer has acknowledged their responsibility, may actually impede genuine moral repair by preventing honest confrontation with the seriousness of what occurred. True forgiveness emerges from strength rather than weakness, and represents a choice to move beyond resentment for the sake of future possibilities, rather than acceptance of continued abuse or disrespect. The process of seeking forgiveness from those we have harmed involves more than simply apologizing and asking to be forgiven. Genuine accountability requires taking full responsibility for wrongdoing without making excuses, minimizing harm, or blaming the victim for their response. It involves making sincere efforts to understand the impact of our actions on others and demonstrating through changed behavior that we have learned from our mistakes. Effective apologies acknowledge specifically what we did wrong, express genuine remorse for the harm caused, and include commitments to different behavior in the future. However, seeking forgiveness also requires accepting that those we have harmed may not be ready or willing to forgive, and that forgiveness cannot be demanded or forced, but must be freely given. The focus must be on making amends and demonstrating change regardless of whether forgiveness is ultimately granted, recognizing that the process of moral repair serves important purposes even when full reconciliation is not possible. Forgiveness in social and political contexts involves additional complexities because it must address not only individual relationships but also broader patterns of injustice and systematic harm. When entire groups have been harmed by discrimination, violence, or oppression, the process of moral repair may require institutional changes, reparations, and collective acknowledgement of wrongdoing in addition to individual forgiveness. Truth and reconciliation processes in countries like South Africa have demonstrated both the possibilities and the limitations of forgiveness-based approaches to addressing large-scale moral failures. These processes can help societies move beyond cycles of violence and resentment, but they may also fall short of full justice if they emphasize reconciliation at the expense of accountability, or if they place unfair burdens on victims to forgive without requiring adequate changes from those who perpetrated harm. Effective social forgiveness requires balancing the need for reconciliation with the need for justice, ensuring that forgiveness does not become a substitute for addressing the structural causes of harm. It also requires recognizing that different individuals and communities may be ready for forgiveness at different times, and that healing processes must respect these differences rather than imposing uniform expectations about when and how forgiveness should occur. The cultivation of forgiveness as a personal capacity can contribute to both individual well-being and social healing, but it requires careful attention to the conditions that make genuine forgiveness possible. Research shows that people who are able to forgive tend to experience less stress, depression and anger while maintaining better physical health and social relationships. However, these benefits depend on forgiveness being genuine rather than forced or superficial, and on forgiveness being accompanied by appropriate boundaries and safety measures when necessary. Developing the capacity for forgiveness often requires working through one's own experiences of being harmed, learning to separate forgiveness from trust or reconciliation, and finding ways to hold both accountability and compassion in tension. It may also require spiritual or therapeutic support to process difficult emotions and develop new perspectives on harmful experiences. The goal is not to become someone who automatically forgives all wrongdoing regardless of circumstances, but to develop the wisdom to know when forgiveness is appropriate and the capacity to engage in genuine forgiveness when it serves healing and moral growth for all parties involved. Part 20. Moral responsibility and free will. The question of moral responsibility depends fundamentally on our understanding of human freedom and the extent to which individuals have genuine control over their actions and choices. If our behavior is entirely determined by factors beyond our control, such as genetic inheritance, social conditioning, or neurological processes, then it might seem unfair to hold people morally responsible for their actions. Conversely, if we have significant freedom to choose how we act, then moral responsibility becomes meaningful and moral evaluation of behavior becomes justified. Understanding the relationship between freedom and responsibility is crucial for making sense of moral praise and blame, punishment and reward, and our expectations about how people should treat each other. Modern neuroscience has revealed that much of our behavior is influenced by unconscious brain processes that occur before we become consciously aware of our decisions. Brain imaging studies show that neural activity associated with certain choices begin several seconds before people report being aware that they have decided to act. This research suggests that consciousness may play less of a role in decision-making than we typically assume, and that many of our choices may be determined by unconscious processes rather than deliberate rational reflection. However, this does not necessarily eliminate moral responsibility, because consciousness may still play important roles in evaluating, modifying and inhibiting actions, even if it does not initiate them. The capacity to reflect on our impulses, to consider their moral implications, and to choose whether to act on them may be sufficient for moral responsibility, even if we do not have complete conscious control over the initial generation of those impulses. This suggests a more nuanced understanding of moral responsibility that focuses on our capacity for moral reflection and self-regulation, rather than requiring complete conscious control over all aspects of behavior. Social and environmental factors also significantly influence behavior in ways that complicate simple attributions of moral responsibility. People who grow up in poverty, experience trauma, or are exposed to violence may develop patterns of behavior that are adaptive in dangerous environments, but problematic in other contexts. Mental illness, substance addiction and other conditions can impair judgment and impulse control in ways that affect moral decision-making. Cultural differences in values and socialization can lead to different understandings of appropriate behavior that may conflict with the moral expectations of other communities. These factors do not necessarily eliminate moral responsibility, but they do suggest that moral evaluation should take into account the circumstances and constraints that shape individual choices. A compassionate approach to moral responsibility recognizes that people's capacity for moral action is influenced by factors beyond their control, while still maintaining that most individuals have some degree of agency and therefore bear some responsibility for their choices within the constraints they face. The concept of moral responsibility also involves forward-looking as well as backward-looking considerations about how to respond to moral failures in ways that promote future moral behavior. Punishment and blame may be justified not only because people deserve negative consequences for wrongdoing, but also because these responses can deter future wrongdoing and communicate important moral values to both wrongdoers and the broader community. Conversely, excessive punishment that goes beyond what is proportionate to the wrongdoing or that fails to provide opportunities for moral learning and growth may be counterproductive even if the original moral responsibility is clear. This suggests that moral responsibility should be understood not only in terms of desert and retribution, but also in terms of what kinds of responses are most likely to promote moral improvement and social welfare. Effective approaches to moral responsibility often combine accountability for wrongdoing with support for moral development and opportunities for redemption and reintegration into moral community. The goal is to respond to moral failures in ways that acknowledge their seriousness while promoting rather than undermining future moral agency and social cooperation. Practical approaches to moral responsibility in families, organizations, and legal systems can benefit from recognizing both the complexity of human agency and the importance of maintaining moral accountability. This might involve graduated approaches to responsibility that take into account factors like age, mental capacity, social circumstances, and opportunities for moral learning. It might also involve focusing on restorative rather than purely punitive approaches that emphasize making amends, learning from mistakes, and preventing future harm rather than simply imposing suffering on wrongdoers. At the same time, maintaining moral responsibility requires avoiding excuses that eliminate accountability entirely, or that fail to recognize individuals' capacity for moral choice and growth. The challenge is developing frameworks for moral responsibility that are both compassionate and demanding, recognizing human limitations while still maintaining expectations for moral behavior and providing support for moral development. This balanced approach to moral responsibility can help create communities that are both just and forgiving, holding people accountable for their choices while providing opportunities for redemption and moral growth. Part 21. Cultural Relativism versus Universal Morality. One of the most persistent debates in moral philosophy concerns whether moral truths are universal across all human cultures, or whether they are relative to particular cultural contexts, and therefore vary legitimately from society to society. This debate has profound implications for how we understand cross-cultural relationships, international law, human rights, and our obligations to respect or challenge practices in other cultures that we might find morally questionable. While few serious thinkers defend either extreme cultural relativism or rigid moral absolutism, finding the right balance between cultural sensitivity and moral principle remains one of the most challenging aspects of moral reasoning in our interconnected world. Understanding the strengths and limitations of both relativist and universalist approaches can help us navigate cross-cultural moral questions with both humility and conviction. Strong cultural relativism holds that moral judgments are always relative to particular cultural contexts and that there are no moral truths that apply across all cultures. According to this view, practices like arranged marriage, female circumcision, honor killings, or authoritarian government cannot be criticized from outside the culture because outsiders lack the cultural knowledge and context necessary to make valid moral judgments. This position emphasizes the importance of understanding practices within their own cultural frameworks and avoiding the imposition of foreign moral standards on societies that may have developed different but equally valid approaches to human flourishing. Cultural relativism also highlights the historical reality that many moral criticisms of other cultures have been used to justify colonialism, cultural imperialism, and other forms of domination that have caused enormous harm. The relativist position encourages humility about our own moral knowledge and respect for the wisdom that may be embedded in cultural traditions that seem foreign or problematic from our own perspective. However, strong cultural relativism faces serious philosophical and practical difficulties that limit its usefulness as a complete moral framework. The most fundamental problem with cultural relativism is that it seems to make moral criticism and moral progress impossible, even within cultures. If moral standards are entirely relative to cultural context, then individuals within a culture cannot legitimately criticize their own cultural practices or work for moral reform. This would mean that abolitionists in the 19th century United States had no grounds for criticizing slavery, that civil rights activists in the 20th century had no basis for challenging racial segregation, and that contemporary advocates for gender equality have no justification for opposing sexist practices. But most people believe that these reform movements were morally justified and that societies can improve their moral practices over time through criticism and change. Cultural relativism also struggles to explain why some cultural practices, such as genocide or systematic torture, seem wrong, regardless of the cultural context in which they occur. Even cultures that practice these behaviors often recognize them as morally problematic, suggesting that there may be some moral standards that transcend particular cultural boundaries. Universal approaches to morality maintain that there are some moral truths that apply to all human beings, regardless of their cultural background. These approaches typically focus on fundamental human needs, capacities and vulnerabilities that are shared across cultures and argue that moral principles should be based on these universal features of human nature. Universal human rights represent one influential attempt to identify moral standards that should apply across all cultures, focusing on basic needs for security, freedom and dignity that all humans share. Universalist approaches provide a foundation for moral criticism of harmful practices regardless of their cultural context, and for moral solidarity across cultural boundaries based on shared humanity. They also provide a basis for moral progress by identifying standards that can be used to evaluate and improve cultural practices over time. However, universalist approaches face their own significant challenges, particularly the difficulty of identifying truly universal moral principles that are not biased toward particular cultural perspectives. The most promising approaches to cross-cultural morality combine elements of both relativist and universalist thinking while avoiding the extremes of either position. These approaches typically distinguish between core moral principles that apply universally and particular applications or expressions of those principles that may vary legitimately across cultures. For example, all cultures may share commitments to preventing unnecessary harm and promoting human welfare, but different cultures may have different understandings of what constitutes harm or welfare, and different practices for achieving these goals. This approach allows for both moral criticism of practices that clearly violate universal principles and respect for cultural differences in how those principles are interpreted and applied. It also provides a framework for cross-cultural moral dialogue that focuses on shared underlying values while respecting differences in cultural expression and implementation. Such dialogue can lead to mutual learning and moral progress as different cultures share insights about how to achieve common moral goals through different means. Practical applications of this balanced approach require careful attention to the sources and motivations behind moral criticisms of other cultures. Moral criticism is more likely to be legitimate when it comes from within the culture being criticized, when it focuses on practices that cause clear and serious harm, when it is based on principles that the culture itself claims to value, and when it is offered in a spirit of genuine concern rather than cultural superiority. Conversely, moral criticism is more likely to be problematic when it comes entirely from cultural outsiders, when it focuses on practices that are merely different rather than harmful, when it ignores the cultural context and meaning of practices, and when it serves to justify political or economic domination. This suggests that cross-cultural moral engagement should emphasize respectful dialogue, mutual learning, and support for internal reform movements rather than external moral imperialism. The goal should be to work together across cultural boundaries to identify and implement better ways of achieving shared human values, while respecting legitimate cultural differences in how those values are expressed and pursued. This approach requires both moral conviction about fundamental human values and cultural humility about the many different ways those values can be realized in human communities. Part 22. Religion and Moral Authority. Throughout human history, religious traditions have been among the most influential sources of moral guidance, providing believers with comprehensive frameworks for understanding right and wrong that often claim divine authority and timeless truth. The relationship between religion and morality raises fundamental questions about the sources of moral knowledge, the role of faith in moral reasoning, and the extent to which religious moral teachings should influence public policy in diverse societies. While many people find deep moral wisdom and motivation in religious traditions, others worry that religious approaches to morality may be dogmatic, divisive, or inappropriate foundations for moral reasoning in pluralistic communities. Understanding both the contributions and limitations of religious approaches to morality is essential for navigating moral questions in societies where people hold diverse religious and secular worldviews. Religious traditions typically offer several distinctive contributions to moral understanding that are difficult to replicate in purely secular approaches. First, religions often provide comprehensive worldviews that situate moral questions within broader frameworks of meaning, purpose, and ultimate value that can motivate sustained moral commitment even in the face of personal cost or social pressure. When people believe that moral requirements come from a divine source or reflect the fundamental structure of reality, they may be more willing to sacrifice immediate interest for moral principles than when morality is understood as merely human convention. Second, religious traditions typically emphasize the development of moral character and spiritual discipline through practices like prayer, meditation, confession, and community worship that can support long-term moral growth. Third, religious communities often provide social support networks that encourage moral behavior and offer assistance during times of moral struggle or failure. Fourth, Many religious traditions have developed sophisticated approaches to moral reasoning that have been refined over centuries of reflection on complex moral questions. However, religious approaches to morality also face significant challenges that limit their usefulness in diverse societies and their credibility to people who do not share particular religious commitments. Different religious traditions often reach conflicting conclusions about important moral questions, making it difficult to determine which religious moral teachings, if any, should be considered authoritative. Religious moral claims are typically based on faith commitments, scriptural interpretations, or religious authorities that may not be persuasive to people outside particular religious communities. Some religious moral teachings seem to conflict with widely shared moral intuitions about human equality, individual freedom, or the prevention of harm, raising questions about whether religious authority should override other moral considerations. Religious approaches to morality may also discourage critical thinking and moral reasoning if they emphasize obedience to religious authority over independent moral reflection. Additionally, religious differences have often been sources of moral conflict and violence rather than moral understanding and cooperation. The role of religion in public moral discourse represents a particularly complex challenge in diverse democratic societies where citizens hold different religious and secular worldviews. In such societies, public policies must be justified in terms that can be understood and evaluated by all citizens regardless of their particular religious commitments. This suggests that religious believers should translate their religious moral convictions into secular moral arguments when participating in public debate about laws and policies that will affect everyone. For example, religious opposition to particular practices might be expressed in terms of their harmful consequences for individuals and society rather than simply as violations of religious law or divine command. However, this requirement for translation raises difficult questions about whether religious moral insights can be adequately expressed in secular terms, and whether asking religious believers to bracket their deepest convictions for the sake of public discourse is fair or realistic. It also raises questions about whether secular moral frameworks are really neutral, or whether they embody particular worldview commitments that are no more universal than religious ones. Many contemporary approaches to religion and morality seek to find middle ground that acknowledges both the valuable contributions of religious traditions to moral understanding and the need for moral reasoning that can be shared across religious and secular boundaries. These approaches often emphasize the common moral concerns that unite different religious traditions and secular moral philosophies, such as commitments to reducing suffering, promoting human flourishing, and treating all people with dignity and respect. They also recognize that religious and secular moral traditions can learn from each other, with religious traditions offering insights about meaning, motivation and spiritual development, while secular traditions contribute tools for critical reasoning and empirical investigation. Interfaith dialogue and religious secular cooperation on shared moral concerns can help build bridges across different worldview communities while respecting the distinctive contributions that each tradition brings to moral understanding. The goal is not to create a single universal moral framework that everyone must accept, but to develop approaches to moral cooperation that allow people with different foundational commitments to work together on shared moral concerns. This requires both religious believers and secular thinkers to maintain their own convictions while developing appreciation for the moral insights and motivations that can be found in other traditions. Part 23. Business Ethics and Corporate Responsibility. The modern business world presents complex moral challenges that arise from the intersection of profit-seeking behavior, competitive markets, and social responsibilities to employees, customers, communities, and society as a whole. Understanding how moral principles apply in business contexts requires grappling with questions about the proper goals of business activity, the responsibilities of business leaders, and the role of market mechanisms in promoting or hindering moral behavior. Business ethics is not simply about avoiding illegal behavior or following minimal compliance requirements, but about developing approaches to business that integrate moral considerations into strategic decision-making and organizational culture. This integration is challenging because business environments often create pressures and incentives that can conflict with moral values, requiring deliberate effort to align business practices with ethical principles. One of the fundamental questions in business ethics concerns the proper relationship between profit maximization and social responsibility. Some argue that the primary responsibility of business is to maximize profits for shareholders within the bounds of law and basic ethical constraints, and that broader social responsibilities should be left to government and non-profit organizations. According to this view, businesses serve society best by focusing on what they do most effectively, which is creating economic value through efficient production and voluntary exchange. Attempts to burden businesses with additional social responsibilities may actually harm society by reducing economic efficiency and forcing business leaders to make decisions about social priorities for which they lack expertise and democratic mandate. However, this narrow view of business responsibility has been increasingly challenged by stakeholder approaches that emphasize business obligations to employees, customers, communities, and other groups affected by business decisions. These approaches argue that businesses have significant power and influence that create moral responsibilities that extend beyond simply maximizing shareholder value. The stakeholder approach to business ethics maintains that businesses should consider the interests of all groups significantly affected by business decisions, not just shareholders. This broader understanding of business responsibility recognizes that business decisions about employment, production, marketing, and investment have profound effects on workers, consumers, suppliers, local communities, and society as a whole. Stakeholder theory suggests that businesses should strive to create value for all these groups, rather than maximizing value for shareholders at the expense of other stakeholders. This might involve paying workers above market wages, providing generous benefits, investing in environmental protection beyond legal requirements, or accepting lower profits in order to maintain employment during economic downturns. Critics of stakeholder approaches argue that they may reduce business efficiency and economic growth while giving business leaders too much discretionary power to make social decisions that should be left to democratic processes. Supporters respond that stakeholder approaches may actually enhance long-term business success by building stronger relationships with key constituencies and creating more sustainable business models. Corporate social responsibility initiatives represent one way that businesses have attempted to address stakeholder concerns and broader social issues. These initiatives might include charitable giving, environmental sustainability programs, diversity and inclusion efforts, ethical supply chain management, or community development projects. At their best, corporate social responsibility programs can address genuine social needs, while also enhancing business reputation and employee motivation. However, critics argue that many corporate social responsibility efforts are primarily public relations exercises that allow companies to appear socially responsible while continuing problematic business practices in their core operations. Effective corporate social responsibility requires integrating social and environmental considerations into core business strategy, rather than treating them as optional add-ons that can be abandoned when economic pressures increase. It also requires genuine accountability and transparency, so that stakeholders can evaluate whether corporate social responsibility claims are supported by actual business practices. The globalization of business has created new challenges for business ethics by extending business relationships across different cultural, legal, and economic contexts. Multinational corporations must navigate different moral standards, legal requirements, and social expectations in different countries while maintaining consistent ethical standards across their global operations. This creates dilemmas about whether to follow local practices that may conflict with home country values, whether to impose home country standards in contexts where they may be culturally inappropriate, and how to address situations where legal requirements in different countries conflict with each other. Global supply chains create additional complications by making it difficult for companies to monitor and control the labor and environmental practices of suppliers and subcontractors in distant locations. Addressing these challenges requires developing international standards and monitoring systems that can ensure consistent ethical practices across global business operations. It also requires companies to take active responsibility for understanding and improving practices throughout their supply chains, rather than claiming ignorance about conditions they have not directly investigated. Individual business professionals face their own ethical challenges in navigating pressures for performance, advancement and profitability, while maintaining personal integrity and moral values. These challenges might include pressure to mislead customers about product capabilities, to cut corners on safety or environmental requirements, to discriminate in hiring or promotion decisions, or to engage in corruption or other illegal practices. Developing personal business ethics requires building skills in moral reasoning, moral courage, and effective communication that can help professionals address these pressures constructively. It also requires building support networks and career strategies that reduce dependence on organizations or situations that require compromising fundamental moral values. Professional organizations, business schools and employers can support individual business ethics by establishing clear ethical guidelines, providing ethics training, creating safe channels for reporting concerns, and rewarding ethical behavior rather than just short-term financial results. The goal is to create business environments where ethical behavior is supported and rewarded rather than undermined by competitive and organizational pressures. Part 24. Medical ethics and healthcare decisions. Medical practice involves some of the most profound moral questions human beings face, as healthcare decisions directly affect fundamental human interests in life, health, suffering, autonomy, and dignity. The relationship between healthcare providers and patients creates special moral responsibilities because of the vulnerability of patients, the expertise of providers, and the intimate nature of medical care. Medical ethics has developed sophisticated frameworks for addressing these moral complexities, but advances in medical technology, changes in healthcare systems, and evolving social values continue to create new ethical challenges. Understanding the core principles of medical ethics and their application to contemporary healthcare dilemmas is essential for both healthcare professionals and patients navigating an increasingly complex medical landscape. The principle of autonomy holds that competent patients have the right to make informed decisions about their own medical care, even when healthcare providers disagree with those decisions. This principle reflects broader moral commitments to individual freedom and self-determination, recognizing that people have different values, priorities, and life plans that should be respected in medical decision-making. Respecting patient autonomy requires providing patients with accurate information about their condition, treatment options, risks, and benefits so that they can make genuinely informed choices. It also requires recognizing that patients may legitimately choose to refuse recommended treatments, accept higher levels of risk, or prioritize quality of life over quantity of life in ways that healthcare providers might not personally endorse. However, autonomy is limited by considerations of harm to others and by questions about the competence of patients to make complex medical decisions, particularly when they are affected by pain, medication, mental illness, or emotional distress. Determining when patients are competent to make autonomous decisions and how to respect autonomy while preventing serious harm requires careful judgment and ongoing dialogue between patients and providers. The principle of beneficence requires healthcare providers to act in ways that promote the welfare and best interests of their patients. This principle reflects the fundamental purpose of medicine as a healing profession dedicated to reducing suffering and promoting health and well-being. However, beneficence can conflict with autonomy when patients make choices that healthcare providers believe are harmful, or when patients refuse treatments that providers believe would be beneficial. Beneficence also raises difficult questions about how to define patient welfare and best interests, particularly when patients have different values and priorities than their healthcare providers. Additionally, the principle of beneficence must be balanced against resource constraints and competing obligations to other patients, creating dilemmas about how to allocate limited medical resources in ways that maximize overall benefit. Effective application of beneficence requires healthcare providers to understand patients' individual values and circumstances rather than imposing their own judgments about what would be best. The principle of non-maleficence, often summarized as first, do no harm, requires healthcare providers to avoid causing unnecessary suffering or injury to patients. This principle recognizes that medical interventions often involve risks and side effects that must be carefully weighed against potential benefits. Non-maleficence is particularly important in situations involving experimental treatments, end-of-life care, and interventions with uncertain outcomes where the risk of harm may be substantial. The principle also applies to situations where continuing treatment may cause more suffering than benefit, suggesting that sometimes the most compassionate response is to withhold or withdraw interventions rather than pursuing all possible treatments. However, non-maleficence can conflict with beneficence when potentially helpful treatments also carry significant risks, requiring careful assessment of the probability and magnitude of both benefits and harms. The principle also raises questions about what constitutes harm in medical contexts, as patients may have different views about which outcomes they consider most harmful or unacceptable. The principle of justice in medical ethics concerns the fair distribution of healthcare resources and the equal treatment of patients regardless of their social status, ability to pay, or other morally irrelevant characteristics. Justice requires that medical decisions be based on medically relevant factors such as diagnosis, prognosis, and likelihood of benefit rather than on factors like race, gender, social class, or personal relationships with healthcare providers. However, justice also raises difficult questions about how to allocate scarce medical resources when not all patients who could benefit from treatment can receive it. Should organ transplants go to patients who are most likely to survive, those who have waited longest, those who are youngest, or those who are most socially valuable? Should expensive treatments be provided to all patients who might benefit regardless of cost, or should cost-effectiveness be considered in treatment decisions? These allocation decisions often involve tragic choices where any decision will result in some patients not receiving treatments that could help them, requiring careful ethical analysis to determine the most just approach. Contemporary medical ethics faces new challenges from advances in medical technology that create previously unimaginable possibilities for extending life, enhancing human capabilities, and manipulating biological processes. Genetic testing and gene therapy raise questions about privacy, discrimination, and the extent to which parents should be able to influence the genetic characteristics of their children. Life-sustaining technologies create dilemmas about when it is appropriate to withhold or withdraw treatment, and how to balance the sanctity of life against concerns about quality of life and patient suffering. Reproductive technologies enable new forms of family formation, but also raise questions about the commodification of reproduction and the rights and responsibilities of all parties involved. Artificial intelligence and robotic surgery offer possibilities for more precise and effective treatments, but also create questions about accountability when technology fails, and about the changing role of human judgment in medical decision-making. Addressing these challenges requires ongoing dialogue between medical professionals, ethicists, patients, and society about how to use new medical capabilities in ways that serve human flourishing while respecting fundamental moral values. Part 25. War, Violence and Just War Theory. The use of violence and force in human affairs represents one of the most challenging areas of moral reasoning, particularly when considering questions of war, self-defense, and the protection of innocent people from aggression and oppression. While most moral traditions recognize a strong presumption against violence and the taking of human life, many also acknowledge that there may be circumstances where violence is morally justified or even morally required to prevent greater harms. Just war theory has emerged as the most influential framework for thinking about the moral dimensions of warfare and the conditions under which the use of military force might be ethically justified. Understanding these moral frameworks can help us evaluate contemporary conflicts and military interventions while maintaining both a commitment to peace and a realistic understanding of the tragic circumstances that sometimes make violence seem necessary. Just war theory traditionally divides the moral evaluation of war into two main categories: the justice of going to war in the first place, known as jus ad bellum, and the justice of conduct within war, known as jus in bello. The criteria for just cause in going to war typically include self-defense against aggression, defense of others who are being attacked, and intervention to stop massive human rights violations such as genocide or ethnic cleansing. However, just cause alone is not sufficient to justify war, which must also meet additional criteria, including legitimate authority, right intention, last resort, probability of success, proportionality, and comparative justice. These criteria are designed to ensure that war is undertaken only when necessary to address serious injustices, and only when there is reasonable hope that military action will actually improve the situation rather than making it worse. The requirement of last resort means that all reasonable non-violent alternatives must be exhausted before resorting to military force, while proportionality requires that the expected benefits of war outweigh its expected costs in human suffering and destruction. Right intention focuses on the motivations behind military action, requiring that war be undertaken for genuinely moral purposes rather than for conquest, revenge, or economic gain. The principles governing conduct within war, or jus in bello, focus on discrimination between combatants and non-combatants and proportionality in the use of force. The principle of discrimination holds that military actions should target only legitimate military objectives and should avoid deliberately harming civilians who are not participating in hostilities. This principle reflects the moral intuition that people who are not contributing to military aggression should not be subjected to violence, even during wartime. However, the discrimination principle raises difficult questions about how to classify people who support military efforts without directly participating in combat, such as workers in weapons factories or government officials who support military policy. The principle of proportionality in warfare requires that military tactics and weapons be appropriate to their military objectives and not cause excessive civilian casualties or destruction relative to the military advantage gained. These principles are intended to limit the suffering and destruction caused by warfare, even when war itself is justified, recognizing that the moral permission to use force does not extend to unlimited violence against all members of an enemy society. Contemporary warfare raises new challenges for just war thinking that traditional frameworks may not adequately address. Terrorism and insurgency blur the lines between combatants and civilians in ways that make discrimination increasingly difficult, particularly when fighters deliberately hide among civilian populations or when civilians provide support and intelligence to military forces. Cyber warfare and drone attacks create new possibilities for conducting military operations across national boundaries without traditional declarations of war or clear battlefield boundaries. Humanitarian interventions to stop genocide or other mass atrocities may be morally urgent but legally questionable when they lack authorization from international institutions. Preventive wars aimed at stopping future threats rather than responding to current aggression raise questions about how certain we must be about future dangers before military action becomes justified. These developments require extending and adapting just war principles to address new forms of conflict while maintaining their core insights about the moral limits on violence. The question of individual moral responsibility in warfare affects both military personnel, who must decide whether to participate in military actions, and civilians, who must evaluate their government's military policies. Military personnel may face conflicts between orders from superiors and their own moral judgments about the legitimacy of particular military actions or tactics. While military discipline and hierarchy are essential for effective military operations, military personnel also have moral obligations not to participate in war crimes or clearly unjust military actions. This creates dilemmas about when military personnel should refuse orders, report suspected war crimes, or seek discharge from military service based on moral objections. Civilians in democratic societies bear some moral responsibility for military actions taken in their name by their governments, but the extent of this responsibility depends on factors such as democratic accountability, access to information, and opportunities for political influence. These questions become particularly acute during prolonged conflicts where initial justifications may no longer apply, or where military strategies evolve in ways that raise new moral concerns. Pacifist alternatives to just war theory argue that violence is never morally justified, and that non-violent resistance and conflict resolution should always be preferred to military force. Pacifists point to the enormous human costs of warfare, the tendency for violence to escalate and perpetuate cycles of retaliation, and the availability of non-violent alternatives for addressing injustice and aggression. Historical examples of successful non-violent resistance, such as the independence movements led by Gandhi and the civil rights movement in the United States, demonstrate that non-violent approaches can sometimes achieve goals that violent approaches cannot. However, pacifist approaches face the challenge of explaining how to respond to aggressive dictators and genocidal regimes that seem unwilling to respond to non-violent pressure and may interpret non-resistance as weakness or permission to continue their harmful actions. The debate between just war theory and pacifism reflects deeper questions about human nature, the effectiveness of different approaches to social change, and the moral weight we should place on avoiding violence versus preventing other forms of serious harm. Both approaches share commitments to peace and human welfare, but they differ in their judgments about when and whether violence can serve these ultimate goals. Part 26. Human Rights and Universal Dignity. The concept of human rights represents one of the most influential developments in modern moral and political thinking, providing a framework for identifying fundamental protections and entitlements that all human beings should enjoy simply by virtue of their humanity. Human rights claims assert that there are certain ways of treating people that are always wrong, and certain basic needs and freedoms that all people deserve, regardless of their nationality, culture, religion, or other characteristics. Understanding the philosophical foundations of human rights, their practical applications and their limitations is crucial for addressing many contemporary moral challenges, including global poverty, political oppression, discrimination, and social justice. While human rights language has become nearly universal in international discourse, significant disagreements remain about which rights are most fundamental and how rights claims should be balanced against other important values and considerations. The foundation of human rights lies in the recognition of human dignity, the idea that all human beings possess a special moral status that entitles them to certain protections and considerations. This dignity is typically understood as inherent rather than earned, meaning that people possess it simply by virtue of being human, rather than because of their achievements, social contributions, or other variable characteristics. The inherent dignity of human beings provides the basis for claims that certain treatments are always wrong, such as torture, slavery, or deliberate targeting of civilians in warfare, regardless of the consequences or cultural context. It also provides the foundation for positive rights claims about what people are entitled to receive, such as basic healthcare, education, or political participation. However, the concept of human dignity is itself philosophically complex and contested, with different traditions offering different accounts of what makes human beings special and what kinds of treatment this special status requires. Some ground human dignity in religious beliefs about humans being created in the image of God, others in philosophical arguments about human rationality and autonomy, and still others in empirical observations about human capacities for suffering, relationships, and moral agency. Human rights are typically divided into several categories that reflect different types of claims about what people are entitled to receive or be protected from. Civil and political rights include protections for fundamental freedoms, such as freedom of speech, religion, assembly, and political participation, as well as protections against arbitrary detention, torture, and other forms of government abuse. These rights focus primarily on limiting government power and ensuring that individuals have the freedom to make their own choices about important aspects of their lives. Economic, social, and cultural rights include entitlements to basic necessities such as food, housing, healthcare, education, and employment, as well as protections for cultural identity and community life. These rights focus on ensuring that people have access to the resources and opportunities necessary for human flourishing, rather than simply being left alone by government. The relationship between these different categories of rights is sometimes contentious, with some arguing that civil and political rights are more fundamental because they protect human freedom, while others maintain that economic and social rights are more important because they address basic human needs. The universality of human rights means that they are supposed to apply to all human beings everywhere, regardless of cultural differences, political systems, or levels of economic development. This universality is essential to the Human Rights Project because it provides the foundation for international criticism of human rights violations and for assistance to people whose rights are being violated by their own governments. However, claims about the universality of human rights face challenges from cultural relativists who argue that different cultures have different values and that imposing universal standards may constitute a form of cultural imperialism. These challenges are particularly acute when human rights claims conflict with traditional cultural practices or religious beliefs, raising questions about how to balance respect for cultural diversity with protection for individual rights. Defenders of universal human rights typically respond that while the specific ways of protecting human rights may vary across cultures, the underlying human needs and vulnerabilities that rights are meant to address are genuinely universal. They also argue that cultural practices that seriously harm individuals cannot be justified simply by cultural tradition, and that people within all cultures deserve protection from abuse and oppression. The enforcement of human rights represents one of the most challenging practical problems in translating moral ideals into effective protections for real people. Human rights violations often occur within sovereign states by governments that do not recognize international authority to intervene in their domestic affairs. International human rights law provides important frameworks for identifying and condemning human rights violations, but it often lacks effective enforcement mechanisms for stopping violations or punishing violators. Military humanitarian intervention to protect human rights can sometimes be effective, but it is expensive, dangerous, and may cause significant harm to the very people it is intended to protect. Economic sanctions and diplomatic pressure may be less harmful than military intervention, but they are often ineffective against determined violators and may impose costs on innocent populations. These enforcement challenges highlight the gap between moral ideals and political realities in human rights protection and the need for creative approaches to international cooperation and accountability. The expansion of human rights concepts to address new challenges and changing social conditions represents an ongoing development in human rights thinking. Contemporary human rights advocates have proposed new rights to address environmental protection, digital privacy, cultural identity, and other emerging concerns that were not anticipated by earlier human rights frameworks. These developments reflect the dynamic nature of human rights thinking and its responsiveness to changing human needs and social conditions. However, the expansion of human rights concepts also raises questions about whether diluting the concept of rights by including too many different claims might weaken its moral and political force. There are also practical questions about how to prioritize different rights claims when resources are limited, and how to balance human rights with other important values such as democratic self-determination, economic development and social stability. These ongoing debates reflect the continued vitality and relevance of human rights thinking, while highlighting the need for careful reasoning about how to apply human rights concepts to contemporary challenges. Part 27. Gender, Sexuality and Moral Progress. The moral status of gender relations and sexual practices has undergone dramatic transformation in many societies over the past century, representing one of the most significant examples of moral progress in modern times. Traditional gender roles and sexual norms that were once widely accepted as natural and morally required are now increasingly questioned and challenged as unjust restrictions on human freedom and equality. Understanding these changes and their moral implications requires examining both the historical systems of gender and sexual regulation that are being challenged and the moral arguments for more egalitarian and inclusive approaches to gender and sexuality. These issues also highlight the dynamic nature of moral progress and the ways in which moral understanding can evolve as societies gain new insights about human nature, equality and freedom. Traditional gender systems in most societies have assigned different roles, expectations and opportunities to men and women based on beliefs about natural differences between the sexes. These systems typically granted men greater authority in public life, economic activity, and political participation, while confining women primarily to domestic roles involving childcare and household management. Such arrangements were often justified by beliefs that men and women were naturally suited for different types of activities and the gender hierarchy was necessary for social stability and family welfare. However, feminist moral and political theory has challenged these arrangements by arguing that gender differences are largely socially constructed rather than naturally determined, and that gender hierarchy causes significant harm to both women and men. Feminist arguments have highlighted the ways in which traditional gender systems limit women's opportunities for education, career advancement, political participation, and personal autonomy, while also restricting men's emotional expression and involvement in family life. These critiques have led to widespread changes in laws, social norms, and institutional practices aimed at promoting gender equality and expanding opportunities for all people, regardless of their gender. The moral case for gender equality rests on several fundamental principles, including equal human dignity, individual autonomy, and fairness in the distribution of opportunities and resources. If all human beings possess equal moral worth and dignity, then social systems that systematically advantage some people over others based on morally arbitrary characteristics like gender violate principles of moral equality. Similarly, if individual autonomy and self-determination are important values, then social restrictions that limit people's ability to choose their own life paths based on gender stereotypes undermine human freedom. Fairness considerations also support gender equality by questioning why accident of birth should determine access to education, employment, political participation, and other important opportunities. These arguments have been strengthened by empirical evidence showing that gender equality benefits not only women but entire societies by utilizing human talents more effectively and promoting economic development, political stability, and social welfare. However, gender equality initiatives continue to face resistance from those who believe that traditional gender roles serve important social functions or who worry that rapid social changes may disrupt family structures and cultural traditions. Questions about sexuality and sexual morality have similarly undergone significant transformation as societies have moved toward greater acceptance of sexual diversity and individual autonomy in intimate relationships. Traditional sexual norms in many societies restricted sexual activity to heterosexual marriage and condemned homosexuality, premarital sex, and other forms of sexual expression as immoral or unnatural. These restrictions were often justified by religious teachings, concerns about social order, or beliefs about the proper purposes of sexuality in human life. However, changing understandings of sexual orientation, gender identity, and the role of sexuality in human flourishing have led to greater acceptance of sexual and romantic diversity. Arguments for sexual freedom typically emphasize that consensual sexual activity between adults is a private matter that should not be subject to social or legal restriction unless it causes harm to others. They also argue that sexual orientation and gender identity are fundamental aspects of personal identity that deserve respect and protection rather than condemnation or suppression. The recognition of LGBTQ rights represents a particularly significant example of moral progress in recent decades, as many societies have moved from criminalizing and stigmatizing sexual and gender minorities to protecting their rights and celebrating their contributions to social diversity. This transformation has involved changes in laws regarding marriage, adoption, employment discrimination, and other areas where LGBTQ people previously faced systematic disadvantage. The moral arguments supporting LGBTQ rights emphasize principles of equal dignity, individual autonomy, and the prevention of harm, arguing that sexual orientation and gender identity are natural variations in human diversity that deserve acceptance rather than condemnation. These arguments have been strengthened by research showing that discrimination against LGBTQ people causes significant psychological and social harm while contributing nothing to social welfare or moral order. However, LGBTQ rights continue to face resistance from religious and cultural traditions that maintain traditional views of sexuality and gender, creating ongoing tensions about how to balance religious freedom with civil rights protection. These debates highlight the challenges of moral progress in diverse societies where different groups hold deeply held and conflicting views about fundamental moral questions. The ongoing evolution of gender and sexual norms illustrates several important features of moral progress more generally. Moral progress often involves recognizing that practices and beliefs that were previously taken for granted may actually cause unjustified harm to individuals and groups. It also typically involves expanding the circle of moral concern to include people who were previously marginalized or excluded from full moral consideration. However, moral progress is not always linear or uncontested, and gains in one area may be accompanied by backlash or resistance that can slow or reverse progress. The pace and direction of moral change also vary significantly across different societies and communities, reflecting differences in cultural values, religious beliefs, and political systems. Understanding these dynamics can help us appreciate both the achievements that have been made in promoting gender and sexual equality and the ongoing work needed to ensure that all people can live with dignity and freedom regardless of their gender identity or sexual orientation. Part 28. Animal Rights and Our Moral Obligations to Non-Human Life. The question of what we owe to animals and other forms of non-human life represents one of the most challenging and rapidly evolving areas of contemporary moral thinking. Traditional moral frameworks have focused primarily on relationships between human beings, treating animals as resources for human use rather than as beings with their own interests and rights. However, growing scientific understanding of animal cognition, emotion and suffering has led many people to reconsider the moral status of animals and to question practices that cause animal suffering for human benefit. These questions become increasingly urgent as human activities continue to affect animal populations through habitat destruction, climate change, factory farming, and other practices that may cause enormous amounts of animal suffering. The foundation for extending moral consideration to animals lies in recognition that many animals are sentient beings capable of experiencing pleasure, pain, fear, and other subjective states that matter to them. This capacity for suffering suggests that animal welfare should be taken seriously in moral decision-making, even if we do not grant animals exactly the same moral status as human beings. Utilitarian approaches to animal ethics argue that the suffering of animals should count equally with the suffering of humans in moral calculations, meaning that we should consider the interests of all sentient beings rather than privileging humans simply because they are members of our own species. This approach would require dramatic changes in practices such as factory farming, animal experimentation, and entertainment that cause significant animal suffering for relatively minor human benefits. Rights-based approaches to animal ethics go further by arguing that animals possess inherent rights not to be harmed or used merely as resources for human purposes, regardless of the consequences for human welfare. This approach would prohibit most forms of animal use, even when they do not involve obvious suffering, on the grounds that treating animals as mere property or tools violates their basic rights as sentient beings. Factory farming represents one of the most significant sources of animal suffering in the modern world, involving billions of animals raised in intensive confinement systems designed to maximize production efficiency rather than animal welfare. These systems often prevent animals from engaging in natural behaviors, subject them to painful procedures without anesthesia, and create conditions that cause chronic stress and suffering throughout their lives. The scale of factory farming means that the total amount of animal suffering involved may be enormous, particularly when compared to the relatively modest human benefits involved in producing cheaper meat, dairy, and eggs. Critics of factory farming argue that these practices cannot be justified morally given the availability of alternative food sources that do not require animal suffering. However, defenders of current agricultural practices argue that they are necessary to provide affordable protein to growing human populations and that properly regulated animal agriculture can minimize suffering while still meeting human nutritional needs. These debates raise fundamental questions about the moral weight of animal interests compared to human interests and about the feasibility and consequences of dramatically reducing animal agriculture. Animal experimentation presents another complex area where animal interests conflict with potential human benefits, particularly in medical research that might lead to treatments for serious human diseases. Many medical advances have depended on animal research, and continued progress in treating diseases such as cancer, Alzheimer's, and diabetes may require continued animal experimentation. However, animal experimentation often involves causing significant pain, distress and death to animals who cannot consent to participate in research and who do not benefit from the knowledge gained. The moral justification for animal experimentation typically depends on arguments that human interests are more morally significant than animal interests and that animal suffering is justified when it prevents greater human suffering. Critics of animal experimentation argue that these arguments reflect unjustified bias toward humans and that alternative research methods such as computer modeling, cell cultures, and human volunteers should be developed to replace animal research. Current approaches to animal research ethics typically require researchers to follow principles of replacement, reduction, and refinement, seeking alternatives to animal use when possible, minimizing the number of animals used and reducing animal suffering when animal use is deemed necessary. Environmental considerations add another dimension to questions about our obligations to animals and other forms of life by focusing attention on ecosystems, species preservation, and the intrinsic value of biodiversity. While individual animal welfare approaches focus on the suffering of particular animals, environmental approaches emphasize the importance of maintaining healthy ecosystems and preserving species diversity for their own sake or for the sake of future generations. These approaches sometimes conflict with individual animal welfare concerns, as ecosystem management may require culling overpopulated species or allowing natural predation and disease that cause individual animal suffering. They also raise questions about the moral status of non-sentient life forms such as plants, fungi and bacteria, which may not experience suffering but may still have some form of intrinsic value or importance. Some environmental philosophers argue for biocentric or ecocentric approaches that recognize the moral value of all living things or of ecosystems as wholes, while others maintain that only sentient beings can have morally relevant interests. These debates reflect deeper questions about the scope of moral consideration and the relationship between individual welfare and collective goods in environmental decision-making. Practical applications of animal ethics require balancing competing considerations and developing policies that can guide both individual choices and social institutions. Individual consumers face decisions about diet, clothing, entertainment, and other choices that affect animals, while also considering factors such as health, cost, cultural practices, and social relationships. Policymakers must balance animal welfare considerations against economic interests, cultural traditions, and human welfare in areas such as agricultural regulation, research oversight, and wildlife management. These practical applications often require compromise and incremental progress rather than immediate implementation of ideal animal ethics principles, particularly given the economic and social changes that would be required to eliminate all practices that harm animals. However, growing public concern about animal welfare and environmental sustainability is driving changes in consumer behavior, business practices, and government policies that may gradually reduce animal suffering and better protect animal interests. The development of alternative proteins, improved animal welfare standards, and more sophisticated approaches to wildlife conservation suggests that it may be possible to meet human needs while substantially reducing harm to animals and other forms of life. Part 29. Death, Dying, and End-of-Life Ethics. Questions about death and dying touch on some of the most profound and personal aspects of human existence, involving fundamental values about the meaning of life, the nature of suffering, and the extent of individual autonomy over our own bodies and lives. Advances in medical technology have dramatically expanded our ability to extend life and postpone death. But they have also created new dilemmas about when continued treatment is beneficial and when it may cause more harm than good. Understanding the ethical frameworks that can guide end-of-life decision-making is crucial for individuals facing their own mortality, families dealing with the serious illness of loved ones, and healthcare providers who must balance multiple obligations and competing values. These decisions are often complicated by uncertainty about prognosis, disagreements about values and priorities, and the emotional intensity that naturally accompanies confrontation with death. The principle of autonomy at the end of life emphasizes that competent individuals should have the right to make informed decisions about their own medical care, including decisions to refuse life-sustaining treatment, even when such refusal will result in death. This principle recognizes that people have different values about what makes life worth living, and that some individuals may reasonably conclude that continued life with severe illness, disability, or suffering is worse than death. Respect for autonomy typically requires that patients be provided with honest information about their prognosis and treatment options so that they can make genuinely informed choices about their care. It also supports the use of advanced directives and other mechanisms that allow people to express their preferences about end-of-life care before they become unable to communicate their wishes. However, autonomy at the end of life is complicated by questions about how to interpret unclear or conflicting advance directives, how to handle changes in patient preferences over time, and how to assess the competence of patients who may be affected by pain, medication, or emotional distress. It is also limited by considerations about the effects of patient choices on family members, healthcare providers, and society as a whole. The distinction between killing and letting die has been central to many discussions of end-of-life ethics, with most ethical frameworks treating these as morally different even when they result in the same outcome. Allowing patients to die by withholding or withdrawing life-sustaining treatment is generally considered ethically acceptable when the treatment is no longer beneficial or when patients have refused such treatment. This approach recognizes that there is no moral obligation to use every possible medical intervention to extend life regardless of the quality of that life or the wishes of the patient. However, actively causing death through physician-assisted suicide or euthanasia remains more controversial, even when patients explicitly request such assistance and are experiencing severe suffering. Critics of physician-assisted suicide argue that intentionally causing death violates fundamental medical values and creates dangerous precedents that could lead to pressure on vulnerable patients to end their lives prematurely. Supporters argue that there is no morally relevant difference between allowing death and causing death when both are intended to relieve suffering and are requested by competent patients who have carefully considered their options. Quality of life considerations play an important but controversial role in end-of-life decision-making, as people must weigh the benefits of continued existence against the burdens of illness, disability, and medical treatment. Some individuals may conclude that life with severe cognitive impairment, chronic pain, or complete dependence on others is not worth living, while others may find meaning and value in life, even under very difficult circumstances. These different perspectives reflect deeper philosophical and religious disagreements about the source of human dignity and the conditions that make life valuable. Some traditions emphasize the inherent sanctity of human life, regardless of its quality or circumstances, while others focus more on consciousness, relationships, and the ability to pursue meaningful activities. Healthcare providers and family members must be careful not to impose their own quality of life judgments on patients who may have different values and priorities, while also recognizing that some patients may need help thinking through the implications of their choices. Quality of life assessments are also complicated by adaptation effects, where people often adjust to disabilities and limitations better than they initially expected, and by the difficulty of accurately predicting future quality of life in the face of progressive illness. Palliative care and hospice approaches to end-of-life care focus on relieving suffering and supporting quality of life rather than trying to cure disease or extend life at all costs. These approaches recognize that death is a natural part of life and that the appropriate goal of medicine when cure is not possible is to provide comfort, dignity and support to patients and their families. Palliative care can be provided alongside curative treatments for people with serious illnesses, while hospice care is typically reserved for people who are expected to die within 6 months and have chosen to focus on comfort rather than cure. Both approaches emphasize pain and symptom management, emotional and spiritual support, and assistance with practical matters such as advanced planning and family communication. Research shows that palliative and hospice care can significantly improve quality of life for patients and families, while often reducing healthcare costs compared to aggressive curative treatments. However, these approaches require cultural and institutional changes to overcome biases that equate good medical care with aggressive treatment and to ensure that comfort care is seen as an active and valuable form of medical intervention rather than giving up. Family dynamics and social relationships add additional complexity to end-of-life decision-making, as the death of one person affects many others who may have different views about appropriate care and different needs for closure and support. Family members may disagree among themselves about what the patient would want or what would be best, particularly when the patient is no longer able to communicate or when advance directives are unclear. Healthcare providers must navigate these family dynamics while maintaining primary loyalty to the patient, while also recognizing the legitimate interests and concerns of family members who will be affected by end-of-life decisions. Cultural and religious differences can further complicate these situations when families have different beliefs about the meaning of death, the importance of preserving life, and appropriate decision-making processes. Effective end-of-life care requires good communication, ongoing emotional support, and sometimes formal mediation to help families work through disagreements and find approaches that honour both patient autonomy and family relationships. It also requires recognizing that the death of a loved one begins a grieving process that may continue long after medical decisions have been made, and that healthcare providers have some responsibility to support families through this difficult transition. Part 30. Building a Personal Moral Philosophy. After exploring the many dimensions of moral reasoning, psychological research, cultural differences, and practical applications, the ultimate challenge is developing a coherent personal approach to living ethically that can guide decisions and actions throughout life. Building a personal moral philosophy is not about choosing one theory or framework and applying it mechanically to every situation, but about developing a thoughtful integration of moral insights that reflects your deepest values while remaining open to growth and revision. This process requires honest self-reflection about your own moral intuitions and commitments, careful consideration of the strengths and limitations of different moral approaches, and ongoing practice in applying moral reasoning to the complex situations you encounter. A mature personal moral philosophy should provide guidance for daily decisions while remaining flexible enough to address new challenges and changing circumstances throughout your life. The foundation of any personal moral philosophy must be a clear understanding of your core moral values and the reasons you hold them. These core values might include commitments to honesty, compassion, justice, freedom, loyalty, or other principles that you consider fundamental to living a good life. Understanding why you value these principles, where they come from in your experience and background, and how they relate to each other can help you apply them more consistently and effectively in complex situations. It is also important to recognize that your core values may sometimes conflict with each other, requiring you to develop approaches for weighing and balancing competing moral considerations rather than expecting simple answers to difficult questions. For example, you might value both honesty and kindness, but find situations where telling the truth would cause unnecessary harm to vulnerable people. requiring you to think carefully about how to honor both values in your response. Developing skill in managing these value conflicts is essential for moral maturity and for maintaining integrity when facing real-world moral challenges. Your personal moral philosophy should also incorporate insights from the various moral traditions and frameworks we have explored, adapting them to your own circumstances and values rather than adopting any single approach exclusively. You might find consequentialist reasoning helpful for thinking about policy questions and large-scale decisions where outcomes for many people are at stake. You might rely more heavily on deontological principles when thinking about fundamental rights and duties that should not be violated regardless of consequences. Virtue ethics might guide your thinking about character development and the kind of person you want to become over time. Care ethics might inform your approach to relationships and responsibilities to particular people in your life. Learning to use multiple moral frameworks and to recognize when different approaches are most relevant can make you a more sophisticated and effective moral reasoner who can address the full complexity of moral life. Practical wisdom in applying moral principles requires developing skills in moral perception, moral judgment, and moral action that go beyond theoretical understanding. Moral perception involves learning to recognize moral dimensions of situations that might not be immediately obvious, particularly in professional, organizational, and social contexts where moral issues may be disguised as purely practical or technical decisions. Moral judgment involves learning to apply moral principles thoughtfully to specific situations, taking into account relevant facts, competing considerations, and likely consequences of different choices. Moral action involves developing the courage and skills needed to act on your moral convictions, even when doing so is difficult, costly, or socially awkward. These practical skills develop through experience and reflection, rather than through abstract study, requiring you to seek out opportunities to practice moral reasoning and moral action in safe contexts where you can learn from both successes and mistakes. Building relationships with other people who share your commitment to moral growth can provide support and accountability for this ongoing development process. Your personal moral philosophy should also include approaches for handling moral uncertainty and moral failure, both of which are inevitable parts of moral life. Even with careful reasoning and good intentions, you will sometimes face situations where you cannot be sure what the right action is or where any available choice seems morally problematic in some way. Developing tolerance for moral uncertainty while still taking action when action is needed requires cultivating humility about your moral knowledge while maintaining confidence in your core values and commitment to doing your best with the information available. You will also sometimes make moral mistakes, either through poor judgment, weakness of will, or insufficient attention to moral considerations. Learning to acknowledge these mistakes honestly, make appropriate amends when possible, and use them as opportunities for moral learning rather than occasions for self-condemnation is essential for long-term moral growth. A mature approach to moral failure recognizes that perfectibility is not required for moral integrity, and that the goal is consistent effort to live according to your values rather than flawless moral performance. Finally, your personal moral philosophy should remain open to growth and revision as you encounter new experiences, learn from other people, and face changing circumstances throughout your life. The moral challenges of youth are different from those of middle age and old age, and the moral insights you gain from education, career, relationships, and other life experiences should inform and refine your approach to ethical living. This ongoing development requires maintaining curiosity about moral questions, willingness to listen to people with different perspectives, and courage to revise your views when you encounter better arguments or evidence. It also requires balancing openness to change with commitment to your core values, ensuring that moral growth represents genuine development rather than mere drift or capitulation to social pressure. The goal is to develop a personal moral philosophy that provides stable guidance for living while remaining responsive to new moral insights and changing circumstances. By committing to this lifelong project of moral development, you honor both your own potential for growth and your responsibility to contribute to the moral progress of your community and society. This is perhaps the most important work any of us can do, as it shapes not only our own character and relationships, but also the kind of world we create together through our daily choices and actions. In the end, the question of what is right and wrong is not just a philosophical puzzle, but a practical challenge that each of us must address through how we choose to live.